Agent Smith.
Hey, how are you?
Solid. What's up, dude?
Oh, not much. How's your week been?
It's been reasonably good. Not quite as explosive with the growth as the week before, but it's been steady. We're looking at like 650 subscribers in the channel now.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
Last weekend I had some like qualifiers and stuff, so we didn't have
Gotcha.
the session.
Yeah, no problem.
So yeah, I mean, stuff has happened in the past. Yeah, in the past week or so, things have transpired. We mentioned the Facebook stuff a little bit, and I don't know if you had the stream open before I jumped in Discord with you, but I was thoroughly entertained that they have an apology message at the top that isn't about what they've done on the grander scale, but there's like one app that apparently stole some people's data, and it was just pure comedy. So Facebook is a thing. That drama, I guess, has played out. Has there been anything else of note on that front lately?
On the Facebook front?
Yeah. Does that matter? Is anything changing, or is it all just a little short
Storm
story?
in a teacup.
Yeah, basically.
Thus far, pretty much. There was Mark Zuckerberg's appearance before Congress, or more accurately, a congressional committee. That didn't really go anywhere. Congressional committees and hearings like that are generally horse and pony shows. They're very shallow in substance, generally.
Yeah, but wasn't this one a horse, pony, and booster seat show?
I suppose you could say that. Yeah, they just wanted to be seen to be doing something about an issue, quote-unquote issue. And once they had their little media circus, they let him go, and now nothing will happen, probably. That would be my prediction.
Well, their stock certainly got hit pretty hard from it, so at least that's something.
Actually, it went up after the hearing.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it got a nice bump. The investors were pleased with his performance, so they doubled down. Yeah, there had been some selling leading up to it, because people were unsure how he would do and what would happen. You know, it's generally not a good idea to piss off congressmen, even if they do appear foolish sometimes. But he did all right. So the investors were pleased, and stock bumped up again when people bought back in.
So the main thing that people were interested to hear about leading up to today's session with you was Syria. So Syria and the U.S., it seems like Trump has been really excited about doing some airstrike or something, but from my perspective, it seems like what is this airstrike targeted toward? What is it going to do? Is it just a way to pander to the base? What's going on here?
Well, it already happened. The airstrikes happened a day or two ago, I think.
Yeah, well, what did it hit? What was the point of it?
They were targeting, ostensibly, they were targeting Syria's chemical weapons program, and more specifically the infrastructure thereof. So they hit the headquarters for a research institute that supposedly is sort of the main institution in Syria responsible for that chemical weapons program. And then they hit some peripheral targets related to that institution, as well as some military targets here and there. Pretty narrow. There were, I think, twice as many missiles launched this time as in the previous airstrikes against, I think the last one was about a year ago against Shariat Air Base, something to that effect. But the scope was very specific. It was very narrowly focused on targets that are somehow related to chemical weapons or the chemical weapons program there. And once they hit them, that was it. It's a limited operation. And they used the deconfliction line that they set up with Russia a couple years ago, specifically to coordinate operations between Russian forces in Syria and U.S. forces to avoid any unnecessary collateral damage against one side or the other from each other's operations. So there was never really much danger of any Russians getting caught up in it. And there was a lot of lead up to the strike, so the Syrians were able to prepare, so I don't know how much they actually really hit. The Syrians were pretty good about moving their assets out of exposed targets into Russian bases. And of course, the United States isn't going to strike Russian bases.
This
So
seems
it was really
contradictory to me, because there's been a lot of pro-Russia kind of discussion from the Trump campaign, and then this seems like if Russia is sort of backing Assad, this is like us playing against that, but in a very soft way.
Well, the Trump administration doesn't care one way or the other about Russia. Nominally, he was pro-Russia during his campaign, but that was always going to be transactional. The Trump administration has been nothing if not transactional since the inauguration. So there is no desire to seek an alliance with Russia per se, but neither is there desire to really go after them. I don't really think this was about Russia. I think it was just a very narrow, specific operation targeting the chemical weapons program after the chemical weapons attack that allegedly happened, what, a week or two ago, I guess. That hit a, what was it, Eastern Ghouta, I think. Douma? I don't know how to pronounce any of these places in Syria, so I apologize if I'm getting them wrong. But yeah, there's a rebel enclave in a suburb of Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. And they've been fighting pretty tenaciously for pretty much from the start, I guess the past 7-some years. But they've come under a lot of pressure over the past month or two, and they've lost a lot of ground, and the Syrian government just about has taken it back. And one of the last holdouts is a neighborhood called Douma. Again, I apologize if that's not the correct pronunciation. And they had an agreement to evacuate civilians, if not also rebels, but supposedly, again, I think this is a week or two ago, supposedly the rebels reneged on it. There was apparently some mortaring from the rebel area, from Douma, and then supposedly the Syrian government says that they did not allow Syrian government forces into Douma as had been agreed. And it was like a day or two after that that the supposed chemical weapons attack happened. So some people say there's no reason for Assad to have used the chemical weapons if that's not entirely true, given that the rebels had reneged on an agreement that could have been a way to try to force them back into the agreement, so that Douma could be evacuated and the regime could take control of it without having to fight house to house in a protracted campaign, in which they would probably lose a number of men and material. So it makes a certain amount of sense in that way, but it's still alleged. You know, nobody's been very open with the proof as of yet. I think it's all probably pretty classified, if it exists. Again, whether you think it's all just bullshit or if there actually was a chemical weapons attack is kind of down to it's kind of up to individuals to decide for themselves, given the information available. But nominally, the U.S. government says it believes that there was a chemical weapons attack, and there has been, at least nominally, in the Trump administration, a desire to hold that red line. And I think for the Trump administration, it's sort of a mark meant to distinguish them from the Obama administration. It's kind of something to feed their base, kind of feed the constituency of the Trump administration. They had contrasted themselves with the previous Obama administration during the campaign and after by saying that they would enforce that red line that the Obama administration had not enforced, or at least in their view had not enforced. That's a whole other discussion about whether or not it was enforced, but the point is the Trump administration has pushed that, and when the chemical weapons attack happened, they probably felt somewhat obligated, if only for that reason, to carry out punitive airstrikes of one sort or another. I don't think there was ever any chance of war. The media just, a lot of people were pretty hysterical in the lead up, thinking that the United States was going to attack and try to overthrow Assad or attack Russians, and I don't think any of that was ever on the table. It was always going to be a limited strike targeting the chem weapons program. And you know, whether or not Assad actually stops using them or not, assuming again that he has been, is open to debate. I mean, there's a pretty good chance that he'll keep using them. I mean, there had been allegations of chem weapons use after the Shariat airbase strikes a year ago, and that didn't, lead to any American response. It's only this past attack in the past week or so that's led to American airstrikes, and it's not entirely clear what made this supposed chemical weapons attack deserving of a response as opposed to the other alleged incidents. Maybe this one was bigger, or maybe this one actually had some evidence that the government hasn't disclosed yet that gave them more certainty than they would have had otherwise. But again, that's just speculation on my part. I mean, frankly, given how many uncertainties there are in what happened and why, it's really mostly just a circus, basically. It's just for show. You know, the Trump administration, for whatever reason, whether because it actually was a chem weapons attack or because they just find it useful to say that it was, asserted that and then followed it up with with a set of punitive airstrikes, which nominally are justified in terms of preventing the standard normalization, so to speak, of chem weapons use. But there hasn't been any follow-up, so, you know, it's not like they're trying to overthrow the government or anything. And I think that's kind of been borne out by subsequent events. The U.S. really hasn't done much in that vein afterwards. And it's not like they really significantly hurt the Assad government or his military capacity. They just hit a few buildings. Most of their pretty much all of their air assets, as I understand it, are intact. And their air assets are kind of what really gives them the edge in the civil war. So I don't think this will have any kind of impact over the long-term course of the conflict. And I don't even really know that it will have an effect on how much the Assad regime uses chemical weapons, assuming again that they've been using them. So basically it was just a one-off, probably done more for PR than anything.
Yeah, it's an interesting aspect of how war is conducted now, where something like an airstrike is very minimal investment compared to something like if you're actually sending in infantry, boots on the ground, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, limited war is pretty much the normal kind now. You know, you don't really see great power conflict anymore. It might come back at some point. We should hope that it doesn't. It hasn't traditionally gone well when it has happened. But yeah, at this moment in history, limited war very much defines international conflicts of one sort or another.
Cool.
Yeah, I don't even know that I would call it war, though, in this case. Because airstrikes, I would call it just more military action, you know, maybe even just a police action. And maybe it's a sign of the times that we've been seeing more of such actions over the past 10, 20 years. But I think it's a stretch to call it war. Intervention maybe, but definitely not. It doesn't really constitute a conflict like, say, Iraq, which was a war, or the subsequent conflict. You know, I'm still a little confused about what the terminology is for the different Iraq conflicts. There was the initial American invasion, in which the United States fought basically the Saddam Hussein's government, the Hussein regime, and his Republican Guard, and some Iraqi army units. And then there was the subsequent insurgency, which constituted a separate conflict. Both of those constitute wars, but American actions in Syria thus far haven't really met that bar yet. There has been a lot of support to the YPG fighting the Islamic State. That comes close. You could probably call that a conflict, if not a war. But something like airstrikes on the Assad government, like at El Shariat or the ones in the past week, I don't know that those really qualify. That's kind of getting into semantics a bit, because, you know, different people have different definitions of war. You know, there's a whole literature on that in the academia. And you could spend all day just trying to figure out all the different definitions people have set out. But yeah, I don't think the hysteria was really justified. You know, it was never going to be like Russians dying and then a retaliation and then nuclear exchange. That was never really on the table.
Yeah, there were a lot of World War III kind of questions and memes around this, but it seems like it wasn't anywhere close to the scale necessary to actually provoke something major.
No. No, and I would still argue that the United States really doesn't care that much about the Assad government or Syria in general. You know, the amount of involvement in Syria is not that substantive. There's a couple thousand troops in Syria, in eastern Syria, supporting the YPG, but they're not really doing much. Mostly they're cleaning up what's left of the Islamic State, but there hasn't been any signal that I've seen that the United States has any intention to push on the Assad regime's territory or push on the Free Syrian Army or Turkish allied rebels in the northwest, or really to do much of anything. Just it seems like the plan is just to sit on the territory the YPG has and try to use that fact that the Syrian government does not control that territory as their principal form of leverage and negotiation. That could be worth something, but I don't think they're going to make a full court press to try to just overthrow the government and have the YPG be the government or anything like that. And given that the Trump administration actually a few weeks ago said that, actually it was Trump himself said that he wanted to pull out as soon as possible and then walked back on that a little bit later. That kind of undermines U.S. credibility a bit, and it was already not great. You know, it had been bolstered a bit when there was a long-term commitment made to the YPG. That was kind of in January or February or so. But then with Trump's comments that he wants to pull out as soon as possible, that kind of undermines that. So nobody really knows what the United States wants to do. I don't think even the United States knows what it wants to do in Syria, and that kind of makes it hard for people to plan around, you know, figure out how they're going to approach the issue. Negotiations are complex in that way. You know, if it was clear that the United States were going to stay, that it was going to be a significant actor going forward, then negotiations would probably coalesce around the U.S. and maybe Russia. If the United States left, then that would create a different dynamic in which it would any negotiations would center around Turkey, Russia, and Syria, and the Syrian government. But with the United States kind of half in, half out, like, nobody really knows what to make of it, and it's not clear how negotiations can kind of coalesce when there's that degree of ambiguity. So a lot of actors, I think, are kind of waiting to see what the United States does. I might add here that Russia actually probably could have stopped those airstrikes if it had really wanted to. I noticed that the day before they came out and said that if the United States struck targets in Syria, that Russia might do something in retaliation, which is not a very powerful deterrent. Like, if you really want to stop an actor who has made clear that they have a determination to make an attack of some kind that you want to deter, you really need to come out and say, we will retaliate if you do that. But the Russians didn't do that. They kind of ambiguated and said, well, maybe we'll do something at some point. That's not really good enough. And I think they know that. I think they were pretty much clear that the U.S. strikes were going to happen and that they didn't really want to commit to Syria so much that they would have to respond to such attacks. At least not for something like that. I think they knew that the attacks would be limited, so they figured it would be easier just to let them go through.
U.S., if you do this, we will be mildly upset with you. Uh-oh.
Objectives beyond propping up an ally and trying to build up some diplomatic capital in the region, if not in Europe as well. So they don't really care that much if Assad gets back control of the entire country, or if he just has control of the narrow strip on the west coast. You know, it doesn't matter to them just so long as he stays in power in some way. That's pretty much their only objective. It's pretty limited in that way.
I did see one little post about there was a mayor.
Sorry, what?
There was a mayor in a town in Russia that I think was voicing some anti-Putin sentiments, and I think that town is no longer allowed to vote for their own mayor anymore. Would you believe that?
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah.
It seems a little surprising to me. Most Russians are pretty pro-Putin.
Yeah. Well,
and I doubt the government would need to go that far. You know, it's not hard to swing an election in Russia if you really want to.
Mm.
Yeah, so it seems like a bit of an overreach on the part of the government. Not that the Putin government is beyond the occasional overreach of power, but I don't see any need to do that. So I would be a little incredulous, but I'd be open to it. I haven't read about it, but you know, if somebody can send me a link, I'd be interested in looking into it. It sounds pretty interesting.
Either you're pro-Putin or you're incorrect. And we can help you with that.
Well, let's see. I think we did have a couple of questions. And we've got a whole bunch left over from the last time.
Yep.
Let's see. So, I guess with the two that we got today, what are your thoughts on Russia vetoing chemical investigation unit at the UN and the U.S. bombing of Syria's chemical weapons sites in response to the attack at Dalma? So the Russian government rather, did not actually veto the chemical investigation unit. As I understand it, what they vetoed was giving that investigation unit the power to assign blame. As I understand it, the investigation unit actually is still active and in the field, and it's actually being deployed now to Dalma to investigate the attack. But what the Russians have done is make it so that they cannot assign blame. They cannot assign responsibility, rather, I should say, for the attack. So they can investigate it, they can determine whether or not there was a chemical weapons attack, but they can't say which side or the other was responsible for perpetrating it. And that's probably done for legal reasons, so that nobody can go to the UN and say, oh, hey, we found proof that it definitely was the Syrian government, so that requires some kind of action, which would put Russia in an awkward position of having to veto resolutions that might demand action in response to the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons. So they blocked that off by using the veto. But the investigation is still happening. It is still going on. And they could find that chemical weapons attack did happen, and if they did, the Russian government would probably argue that it was the rebels, that they had chem weapons there, that they were stored there, and that they were hit when the Syrian government struck them, or something like that. I think that was the story that they had the last time around for the incident that led to the El Shariat air base strikes. Let's see. So, with that clarification in mind, thoughts on Russia vetoing, and well, we just talked about the U.S. bombings. That's pretty much my thoughts on that. Let's see. Yeah, I think we pretty much just covered that just now.
Nice.
Yeah. If there's an angle I'm not covering that this person asking wants me to get into, they can kind of feel free to elaborate, and I'll return to it. But I think we pretty much got that. Someone says he heard the Syrian army claim to have intercepted most of the missiles used in the attack. I'm skeptical. They are curious if there was any confirmation of the strikes in Syria, or if this is opposition propaganda. Yeah, I think there are some satellite photos showing the strikes, showing the sites hit before and after. So I think at least some of the targets were hit. I doubt that they would have shot down missiles, though. I don't know that they really have that capability. It's pretty hard to shoot down cruise missiles, as I understand it. If I'm wrong on that, please do say so in chat. I'll add the usual disclaimer here. I'm not a expert in everything I talk about. One of the things I like about coming on is getting feedback from people who know more than I do in chat. So, if I say something stupid or wrong or what have you, or you just want to give feedback, please do add that. Please do add feedback in chat and correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So. It's meant to be more of an exchange, a conversation, even though I know I talk a lot during these. So, please do participate in chat.
You have that being in Discord advantage.
Sorry, what?
You have the being in Discord advantage.
Yeah. Let's see. But yeah, I don't know that there's a capability to really consistently shoot down cruise missiles. I know the United States has the Patriot missile system, but that's come under a lot of criticism for actually being kind of ineffective. The Saudis have been trying to shoot down Scud missiles shot from Yemen, and supposedly they actually haven't shot down any, and they're using the Patriot missile system. And I don't know, maybe the Russians do have a system better than the Patriot system that can shoot down cruise missiles. But cruise missiles, I would imagine, are harder to shoot down than Scuds. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong on that. And but that being, if that assumption is correct, then I would be skeptical that they would be able to shoot down a lot of the missiles. Maybe some of them, but... And given how many that were fired, I doubt it would have mattered anyway. I would imagine if they had that kind of capability, the U.S. military would have accounted for it by assigning multiple missiles to the same target in order to overwhelm any defenses. It's not hard to overwhelm anti-missile defenses. That's one of the reasons that Russia isn't really all that concerned about the anti-ballistic missile systems that the United States is developing. Right now, the Russians have enough nuclear weapons, enough ballistic missiles to easily overwhelm any anti-missile system the United States can field right now. So even if the U.S. were to perfect such technology, they would need to invest in a lot in order to defend even one site, in order to protect it from all of the incoming projectiles. Let's see. But that's my perspective. I'm not like a big technical guy as far as missile systems, so I'm not the best person to ask. But that is my general impression anyway. Let's see. Someone is curious if there is any speculation on how Russia could retaliate, and similarly, someone else says, do you think Russia could retaliate by allowing Turkey more free rein in their campaign in Afrin? Okay. How could Russia retaliate? The Russians themselves, or rather government representatives, said that if there was a strike that they might shoot down the missiles for one, which is not really a retaliation, And the other threat they made is that they might attack the platforms launching the missiles, which is a threat, because that could involve attacking the ships launching the missiles or the aircraft launching the missiles, depending on which platform the US or France or the UK were using. So hypothetically, they could pretty easily attack those. And I think the Russian fleet is meandering or somewhere around the eastern Mediterranean, so hypothetically that could happen. But that would be a pretty substantial escalation. And I don't know that they really want to risk that. And given that the strikes were limited anyway, again, not really much incentive to. Beyond a direct strike against Western assets in the eastern Mediterranean, I mean, the other escalation they could do is just to increase support for the Assad government and put more pressure on rebels, one sort or another, or support clandestine activity in YPG territory in eastern Syria, just to create more instability there and make governance and economic recovery more difficult. But I don't know if they would really care enough to really even go that far. You know, again, I don't think the Russians care that much about strikes like these. You know, for them, so long as it's not designed to overthrow the government, they'll probably just let them go. It's not really worth the effort of really trying to deter them. Let's see, the other one was, do you think Russia could retaliate by allowing Turkey more free rein in their campaign in Afrin? They're already allowing them pretty much free rein. I don't think they can give them much more free rein than they already have. Yeah, the Russians have basically given them access to Syrian airspace. You know, they're not really shooting down Turkish air assets. They're allowing them in. The Syrians said they might shoot them down, but that hasn't happened. And the Syrian government itself deployed some assets to help, actually, the YPG in Afrin, but apparently they left pretty soon after when the Turks made clear that they would come under attack. So, yeah, I don't think there's much more the Russians could do there. I think the Russians basically gave their tacit blessing to the Turkish operation in Afrin. It's not really any skin off their back to do so. You know, the Russians don't care for the Kurds one way or the other, so if Turkey wants to go and do that, that's fine. And Turkey and Russia nominally have a kind of concordant, a sort of understanding in Syria. They're not really going after each other that much. The Syrian government occasionally will launch an offensive. That happened earlier this year, in I think January or February. There was a big offensive into Turkish rebel territory. But that might have been done in conjunction with the Turks in order to attack rebel groups that were not aligned with the Turks. That's a little unclear just as to how that worked out. But the Russians themselves are not really that interested in fighting Turkey, per se, so long as Turkey doesn't push too hard against the Assad government. They kind of have an uneasy peace going there right now. I go into this in more detail on SoundCloud. I have a couple episodes on Syria over there. So if anybody's interested in listening to me go into it in depth, that would be where to go. It's not great. I'm still new at podcasting, so feedback is appreciated. You can tell me how bad it is. But let's see. And then somebody wants to know if Americans are right to be worried about the fact that Trump can approve the strikes in Syria without the approval of Congress, and that there is apparently a memo that details why this is justifiable, but said memo is classified to members of Congress. It's not new. You know, presidents have used airstrikes without notifying Congress for decades now. So that's, I don't know that Trump is particularly dangerous in that regard, because I think people in his administration would warn him if he went too far with that. There are some more hawkish members in his administration now. People like Josh Bolton are in his national security team. But, you know, as realists, as people who are of the realist school of thought in international relations, in the field of international relations, they understand power and they're not going to overreach, or at least they're not going to do anything that would risk a significant backlash. You know, they're kind of sensitive to that, even if they are a little gung-ho and blasé about the use of American force overseas. But, yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about it in that regard. It's always possible, but in general, the legal side of it, and the fact that the memo you mentioned is classified, is not unusual. That's pretty much par for the course. I don't think any administration would, I don't think any given Republican administration, if not also Democratic administration, would be any different. It would probably operate in a very similar way. You know, the Bush administration did that quite a bit back in the day.
That's George W. Just so we're...
Yeah, George W. Bush. Sorry, I should specify.
Since we had two of those. I don't know as much about H.W. Bush, but I did see a graphic that was posted recently of the approval ratings of different presidents. HW had something happen where his hit the floor, basically. What was that? Do you know?
Yeah, that was the no new taxes pledge. Yeah, he was riding high after the Gulf War, very popular. He was a war president, but then he signed off on a tax hike. And it was kind of necessary since there were a lot of deficits in the 80s that were kind of accumulating into the early 90s. So he, along with Democrats in Congress, passed a tax reform that increased well, not even tax reform, rather, but they passed higher taxes for the new budget. And he had pledged earlier in his, when he was campaigning for president, before he became president, that he would, I think the exact quote was, "Read my lips, no new taxes." He pledged that he would not raise taxes, and so then he did. He raised taxes, and that set people off. Yeah, so his support plummeted, and that was also the year that I think Ross Perot ran for president. Well, the presidential election after that, anyway, in which George H.W. Bush was seeking re-election. That was the election in which Ross Perot ran for president. And if anybody doesn't know who Ross Perot is, he's this sort of super wealthy, eccentric Texan. I think he owns a big share in Texas Instruments. And he was this colorful third-party independent candidate who ran in the, I want to say the 92 presidential election, whatever it was. And his big platform was basically reducing government spending, lowering taxes, and reducing deficits. And part of that was spurred by that tax hike that George H.W. Bush had signed off on. And because Ross Perot had so much money of his own money, he was able to run a pretty competitive candidacy. In fact, he actually participated in the presidential debates that year, which is unusual. Normally, third-party candidates are pretty thoroughly excluded. But he made it in, and he was able to eat enough of the vote that conservatives would have normally gotten in order to lose the election for George H.W. Bush. And that was basically how Clinton became president in his first, that's how he got his first term. If not for Ross Perot, George H.W. Bush probably could have squeaked out a victory. But disproportionate, relatively more conservatives than liberals or leftist or whatever you want to call them, were sort of poached by Perot from the respective parties, and that ended up hurting Bush. But yeah, it was pretty much that tax pledge that really got him.
It's when showmanship bites you in the ass, and you make a really awesome speech about how you're making some promise. You could make the same promise in a very kind of subtly stated way, and they're not going to remember it as much. But I feel like you saying the read my lips makes a really memorable quote. And it prints it in the minds of people, which, if you're going to go back on your promises, you don't want to have them remember the promises.
Yeah, he committed pretty hard there. He made it pretty hard for himself to kind of come back on that without significant consequences, and in the end, he kind of bore those. Got to be careful. You're going to make a strong signal, you got to stick to it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Is there any real chance that the Syrian rebels could hold out for much longer, or is their lasting power limited? Let's see. So, well, I mean, they're not really independent anymore. They're really rebels and the Assyrian government, not Assyrian, but the Syrian government. Both rebels and the Syrian government are pretty dependent now on outside support. And so long as they continue getting that outside support, they'll continue to kind of hold positions, continue to be a factor. But as far as being in their own age, in terms of having free agency, most of them don't have it. There are a number. There's a whole lot of rebel groups in Syria. Most of them are a part of larger umbrella organizations, and the smaller ones are generally heavily localized. But some of them will occasionally go their own way. But generally, that brings a lot of pressure to bear on them from the larger groups that do have foreign backing. They kind of do have a de facto veto in that they can ignore host governments to a degree. If the host government negotiates a ceasefire they want them to adhere to, but they don't want to adhere to it, they can just keep fighting. And that puts their host in a position where they can either cut off support but then not have any leverage over the conflict or influence in Syria, or they can let it go, but then not get their ceasefire. So there is a certain amount of autonomy in that way. But as far as the rebels having enough power to overthrow the government or continue holding out, I mean, they can't really push on the government or continue holding out unless they continue getting foreign support. And if, we talked a little bit about Turkey earlier, if Turkey doesn't want to overthrow the Assad government and they've kind of given up on trying, then it's not going to happen. And I think they're only really hanging on, continuing support to rebels because they want to have influence in Syria. They want to have a sort of a vote in how the Syrian government operates, or at least to have a vote through proxies who might negotiate and end up with some power in Syria after a settlement. But beyond that, I don't think there's any desire for Turkey to really escalate the conflict. They're mostly fighting for gains they've made thus far rather than kind of pushing to overthrow the government at this point. The conflict is really kind of in its end stage at this point. The real question is not how much longer is it going to last and which side or the other is going to beat the other. The conflict now is, how are we going to settle this? How do we divide the spoils? Who gets what? And once they kind of get that sorted out, then the conflict will probably come to something resembling peace. Maybe not an outright peace like we might think of it in the West, but as near to peace as you can come after a conflict as violent as that in Syria right now. Let's see, initially hailed as a liberating force in stagnant industries, i.e. taxes, there seems to be a backlash against the so-called gig economy. It has been claimed recently that these markets merely dodge paying benefits normally associated with employment, creating an underclass with no job security. Have similar situations arisen in the past? Can history tell us about what might happen? I don't know enough economic history to know a specific example like that, that resembles the gig economy specifically. But there have been structural economic changes in the past, and longtime listeners have heard me rant about structural economic change plenty of times before. But well, not rant, but talk about it anyway. But there are plenty of examples of structural economic change that have created phenomena like the gig economy. Well, maybe not like the gig economy, that have been disruptive, like the gig economy. Let's put it like that. So the first and second industrial revolution, for example, created a lot of churn in society and in the economy that had repercussions politically. And that created a lot of problems for society because a lot of people ended up in cities, but there wasn't really an infrastructure to support them. So you end up with these sort of Dickensian nightmares where masses of people live in poverty in urban areas and don't really have access to health care or retirement or social benefits, etc. And so all of the factory job itself was originally kind of an adaptation to a response to the Industrial Revolution, a direct result of it. And in that sense, it's kind of a result of structural economic change in that vein. So there's kind of a similar phenomena here where the gig economy is a natural response to structural changes in the economy where there's a lot of people but not a lot of need for them to produce as much stuff. Efficiency productivity has grown so much that you don't need nearly as many people to produce a huge amount of goods as you used to. And the economy and society is still kind of trying to work out what you do with all of this surplus labor, basically. Maybe it gets allocated into new industries that arise in response to opportunities created by the efficiencies and productivities caused by new technology and whatnot. If not also opportunities created by free trade and efficiencies from that. But it's not really clear what those industries would be. If they're going to emerge, they're emerging very slowly. It may be that the answer is just population decline. It may be that just the overall population of a given nation in a given economy or group of nations in a given economic area just doesn't need to be as large. You just don't need as many people. You can support a lot of people with a very small fraction of them engaging in manufacturing and production, kind of like farming and agriculture. There's maybe a few percentage points of the total population that actually engages in agriculture. But here in the United States, that tiny number of people produces enough food to feed everybody in the United States and to have enough left over to be the leading exporter of agricultural goods in the world. That's a lot of productivity, and it may be that we're heading towards something similar with the manufacturing sector, where just tiny numbers of people produce all of the things for everybody. And that kind of creates a new circumstance where You just have all of these other people in the services industry trying to figure out what they're supposed to do to get by. And the gig economy, I think, is an outgrowth of that. I think maybe a better historical example might be the enclosure laws in Britain, way back in what, the 1500s or 1600s. I don't quite remember which. But the enclosure laws basically privatized territory that had privatized land that had previously been more or less public land. It had been communal land that you know, what would you call them? Shepherds basically used to feed their cattle on, you know, public land. They would just kind of go wherever. But when the enclosure laws were passed, people started setting up basically formal farms, what we would think of now as farms or plantations, in order to grow a lot of food for new emerging markets. And that pushed a lot of people off of land that they had previously had ready access to, and created a lot of poverty. And those people were basically just hung out to dry. You know, they either went to cities and tried to find employment there, or they just kind of starved. You know, there are stories from that period of a lot of people just sort of becoming paupers and living off of begging and that kind of thing. So ideally, this current change will not result in that, but hypothetically it could. You know, if you have surplus labor and you don't have anything for them to do, then, you know, what do you do with them? I mean, you can either kind of feed them and try to train them so that they can be useful to the new economy, or you can just, you know, alternatively, you can just kind of let them starve and let them die out. You know, they'll just sort of be an obsolete population that dies out over time and is sort of just replaced by the new economy, the new society, whatever it might look like. That's not a great analogy per se, because again, you're asking specifically for examples of the gig economy historically, and I can't think of any that are really direct analogies that could inform predictions about what the course going forward is. It might also, I think it's also relevant to point out here that some of the gig economy, you know, part of the reason the gig economy emerged is because there was a lot of, it was very difficult to hire and fire workers in Europe, for example, and the gig economy was a way of getting around that. You know, you don't have the same rights as a gig worker, as a temporary worker, basically, as you do as a formal worker, and that gave firms more flexibility with which they could kind of test people out, save money on labor, and try to maintain some of their competitiveness in the face of international pressures. In the United States, we didn't have that problem as much. You know, here it's more of a, what they call in Texas, a right-to-work state, a right-to-work country almost. That's sort of a euphemism here for anti-union. among other things. There's a myriad of laws that kind of tie into it. But even in the United States, there's been a push towards the gig economy because the workers are just cheaper. You know, even in the United States, there is a body of regulation mandating certain responsibilities on the part of employers to formal employees that does not apply to gig workers, to temp workers, whatever you want to call them. And so that makes them attractive. It makes them more efficient if they can tap that labor source. So there is a kind of a regulatory aspect to it. And I'm not saying if you just get rid of all the regulations, then the problem goes away. It doesn't. You know, that would, you know, it's an equilibrium that we're moving towards, where labor is cheaper. That's sort of the general trend you see all over the world. You know, their labor is not as needed, at least unskilled labor, let's put it like that, is not as much demand. And that's creating a lot more supply of that, you know, effective supply. And that's driving down wages. That's kind of a big picture, broad analysis, and I'm sure it misses some of the finer details, but roughly that's the impression of the current structural change happening. Kind of a meandering answer, I'm sorry, that's probably not as specific as you would have liked, so I apologize. I can try again, you know, if there's some particular aspect you want me to visit, then feel free to elaborate and we'll come back to it, but for now that's kind of what I can think of off the top of my head.
Taking a stab at it.
Let's see. What was the original reason the US had to oppose the Assad regime? Was it related to chemical weapons or something else? Well, I mean, the question kind of implicitly assumes that the United States opposed the Assad regime in the first place, and I don't know that it ever really did. Nominally, the United States supported rebel groups here and there But the programs by the military and the CIA were always really ineffective, famously so. I mean, if you watch news here in the United States, you'll probably remember over the past few years hearing about, American-trained rebels getting captured, and having their equipment stolen by jihadis of one sort or another. So a lot of these training programs were kind of half-hearted, and I suspect that was by design. There was a very strict vetting program in place to make sure the United States didn't accidentally support, outright anti-American jihadists in these rebel training programs, and the result was that there were very few rebels trained, because it's very difficult to vet in a war zone, right? You can't just go to the Syrian government and say, oh, hey, do you have any background information on this rebel that's trying to kill you so that I can see whether or not I want to give him money? So there's no central authority that you can kind of vet with. And because of that, it was very difficult to do that. And that severely hampered the effort, and it ended up being scrapped, I think. The military effort first, and then I think the CIA effort was scrapped a couple months ago. So technically the United States is anti-Assad, but it really doesn't seem that way in spirit. Looking at what the United States has actually done, at least publicly, it really doesn't seem like the United States is that committed to overthrowing Assad. It never really has been. And you can kind of see some of that in how the Saudi government and Gulf countries have complained about the lack of American involvement. They've constantly been lobbying the U.S. government to do more in Syria. And the fact that they've never really been satisfied with that kind of gives you an impression of the inertia there as far as American action. But nominally, the reason the United States got involved in so much as it did had to do basically just with Iran. I mean, that was really the only reason. If the Syrian government had broke its alliance with Iran as a condition, basically, to ward off intervention, that probably would have worked. That was the principal issue. I mean, if not for that relationship with Iran, the United States has no reason to care, and it probably wouldn't. And for that matter, the Saudis wouldn't have cared. A big reason that the war broke out, and got worse anyway, was Saudi and Turkish intervention. The Turks would have intervened anyway, in anybody's guess what the hell Erdogan was thinking. My guess is that Erdogan thought it would be easy, that it would be over quickly, kind of like in Libya. But with the Saudis, they were just concerned about Iran. Syria was and remains an Iranian ally, and they want to roll back Iranian influence in the region because they think that the Iranians are actively trying to overthrow the region's governments and replace them with Iranian proxies. The Israelis also are concerned about Iran for obvious reasons, and they also, like the Saudis, want to contain Iran and mitigate any expansion they might make. Being an ally of Syria already, you might think that there's not much they can expand into, but that's not really true. They did not previously have bases in Syria, for example. There's a lot of Iranian troops, deployed in Syria, and that wasn't the case before. And it's debatable whether or not the Syrian government would have even really allowed it, if not for the civil war. But since the civil war did happen, there's a lot of Iranian troops there, and that upsets the Israelis and Saudis even more. Regardless, the initial logic for intervention was predicated on making sure the Iranians did not exploit the conflict to expand their military presence in the region, and by extension, their influence in the region. Syria is right next door to Israel, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's a pretty centrally located country, so there are strategic concerns there if you're a Saudi ruler, or if you're, say, principally the Saudis, I guess, be the main ones. But given that interest in containing Iran, the U.S. had that interest, but the U.S. was not particularly threatened by the Syrian civil war. The Obama administration, well, I guess I should specify Barack Obama and his national security team. There was plenty of people in the Obama administration who thought the United States should do more. But Obama himself and his national security team were very skeptical. They were not that interested in doing it, and that's sort of one of the reasons why they kind of walked back on their famous, red line, claiming that they would strike if their chem weapons were used, and then basically kind of not doing that. They did negotiate a sort of dismantling of the Syrian chem weapons program, but, obviously, they may or may not have actually done that. But technically, they did get that concession from them, so you could argue in a way they did enforce it. But regardless, that's a whole other conversation. We can get into that if somebody wants to. But the point is, the Obama administration was very reluctant excuse me, to get involved. And that kind of bled over into the Trump administration. You know, the involvement that the United States involvement in Syria has been very begrudging and limited, and was basically meant to appease the Saudis. You know, we don't really feel this is a problem. We feel the Iranians already have a lot of influence here, so the civil war isn't really going to change that. You know, having the Assad regime overthrown would be beneficial in that it would erode Iranian influence, but then that creates new problems because that creates more instability in the region because, you know, jihadis will come in, there's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of political instability as different groups vie for power. You know, Libya and Iraq being sort of the case studies there. So while nominally there was an interest, there was a reason because of Iran, the US kind of didn't really think the risk involved in overthrowing the Assad regime was really worth it. But the Saudis did, and the Saudis live in the Middle East and the US doesn't. And nominally it's the Saudis and the Saudi oil that is the principal reason the United States is in the region in the first place. You know, there's a desire, there is a perception that American national security and American national interests require that the United States have a fair amount of influence in the region in order to preclude another incident like, say, the oil shocks in the 70s, or oil revenues being used to support regime change or wars or subterfuge, subversion, what have you, in other countries, things like that, basically. So there's a sense that the U.S. should be involved there to try to prevent things like that from happening, at least in a way that's detrimental to the U.S. national interest. So that being the case, given that we're there for the Saudis, and the Saudis say, this is a problem for us, we need you to help us fix it, we've made some token efforts in order to kind of appease them. Again, I would argue it wasn't anything really substantive, but it was done. And I think the Saudis were pretty much the only reason for that. I had another direction I was going to go in, but it slipped my mind. Again, it's a complicated topic. I go into it more in depth in the SoundCloud series, so I would encourage people to give that a try if you really want to get it. I can't remember all of it off the top of my head. I can remember some of it, maybe even a lot of it, but I'm going to miss some details. Let's see. But that, okay, the original question was, what was the original reason the U.S. had to oppose the Assad regime? Basically that sort of meandering explanation I gave, that's basically the original rationale. And was it related to chemical weapons or something else? Something else. Short answer, something else.
Long answer.
Let's see.
Check out the SoundCloud.
Let's see. A new law intended to curb sex trafficking and threatens the future of the internet as we know it and is Oh, okay. Yeah, I posted an article about a new law regarding regulating sex trafficking online, and somebody read it and is curious if the bills in question set a dangerous precedent for internet use, specifically a section called 230 of the 96 Communications Act, which limits accountability. Yeah. From what I read about it, and if what I read about it was accurate, then yeah, that would substantially change the internet culture, so to speak, and certainly how businesses operate there. Are you familiar with this, Neuro? This was a law passed pretty recently. I think it was called FOSTA, something to that effect.
Oh, what is it?
Can't quite remember the technical name of it. It had some typically arcane, weird, congressional acronym name. Basically, there was a desire to deal with sex trafficking online, because a lot of pimps will advertise, you know, underage prostitutes using sites like Backpage or what have you. And so, you know, Congress wanting to quote-unquote do something doesn't ever really seem to matter if it's actually effective or a good idea, but they always want to do something. They passed a law that makes, let me try to get this right, that makes websites liable if their website is used to host advertising for prostitution, specifically sex trafficking. And the reason that's a problem is because it makes it difficult if you're a large firm with a lot of forums, or even if you're a small firm. You have to basically invest a lot more money into policing your forums. Because if people are creating content on your website that could be interpreted as advertising for underage prostitution, or even just prostitution generally, you could be liable under the law. Now previously, and to a degree, there's this is still true. There was a law called, well, the 1996 Communications Act. This person mentioned it specifically. Section 230 of the 96 Communications Act specified that websites are not liable for content created by users using their website. So if somebody goes onto your website and creates content that is illegal or what have you, they are liable for that, but not you, the website owner. And so that made it much easier for companies and firms and even individuals, not even looking to make a profit, to create forums, websites, social media, companies, I guess, applications, what have you, without fear of legal liability, without fear of being sued into bankruptcy, because it would have been cost prohibitive to try to, well, either they get sued, they don't police their forum, they don't police the content their users are creating, and they risk legal liability, in which case they could be sued into bankruptcy, or they invest so much into policing their content that they have a lot of costs that maybe make the business ineffective, not cost effective, rather. And so it was very helpful, basically, to the emergence of the internet, basically e-business, so to speak, and the current ecosystem on the internet ecosystem as we know it today. That's kind of part of the backbone of the internet. And this new law pokes a hole in that because it makes it so that it's more difficult, basically, to operate without fear of legal liability. You know, you either have to increase your costs substantially in order to make sure nobody is doing anything that could be interpreted as advertising for prostitution, or you risk you just don't do it and risk legal liability. And so this is a big problem in that regard, because it could create a lot of self-censorship, for one, because, again, the law is very ambiguous. That's another problem with the law. It's written ambiguously, such that it's not that you can be convicted if you have advertising for underage prostitutes. It's, do you have any content on your website that could be interpreted as advertising for underage prostitution? And could be interpreted as a very vague term. I mean, anybody, you can always find somebody who could interpret it some way. And so that kind of ambiguity makes liability very broad. It would make it very easy for a prosecutor to accuse and successfully prosecute somebody for being in violation of the law. Because it's very easy to be, again, to be in violation of the law. There is some discretion given to prosecutors as to whether they would convict a given website, because websites could argue, look, we're trying to police the content, and this one got through, we're sorry, we're working on it. And a prosecutor may or may not accept that. You know, pleading poverty is not an excuse under the law. You can't say, well, I tried to adhere to the law, but I just didn't have enough money. That's not good enough. So that's not a sufficient defense. The prosecutor might decide not to prosecute based on that defense, but if the prosecutor goes forward and prosecutes, that defense will not work in court. That's not going. You'll probably be, you'll probably be convicted.
Yeah, well,
so,
it seems like they're taking more of a hardline approach, where there's less room for people to try and find what the line is and dance around it and still get away with it. It's hyper-aggressive response to the issue to really try and stop it, which presents maybe some different problems for the websites themselves, but problems that it seems the lawmakers are willing to kind of sign up for. No, this is a huge problem. We're not messing around with this at all. We want to make this impossible if we can for the bad people who are involved in this kind of trade.
Which is another criticism, because it won't. The other criticism is that it's going to be utterly ineffectual. The law really only applies to websites in the United States. If you have a website that's hosted in Europe or some shit, okay, that's no problem. And there's already, prostitutes and whatnot. Because if you're a prostitute, you can't advertise anymore. That's been one of the visible effects thus far since the bill was passed. Websites are basically purging their users' content, any user content that could be related to prostitution of any kind. And another of the ambiguities in the law is that it doesn't distinguish between ads for prostitution, underage prostitution, and just normal consensual prostitution. It just sort of blanket, it applies to all prostitution, basically, the way it's written. Even if it targets underage prostitution specifically, they're taking a blanket approach. So websites are purging all user content that's even remotely related to prostitution, or even that is not related to prostitution, but could be interpreted as an advertisement for prostitution. So any number of forums relating to, role-playing, sex play, what have you, things like that, a lot of those are having to shut down or significantly change how they operate in response. And prostitutes themselves are being pushed off of their traditional platforms and trying to go to other platforms, generally platforms overseas that are not as vulnerable to the law. Another problem with the law, I might add here, is that the prostitutes themselves are not going to be safer. There is some research, apparently, that this was in the article. You know, it was a pretty all-encompassing article, so I would encourage interested parties to check it out. But there is some research that has found that prostitutes are generally safer when they can advertise online because it gives them a better chance to network with other prostitutes and vet Johns, vet people who use prostitutes, basically, vet clients, let's put it like that. So that they can see, you know, who's violent, who's not violent, etc. They can pick and choose more than if they're working on the street, in which case they can't really do that and they're more vulnerable. And again, sorry,
was
what?
Pointing out if we're trying to be politically correct, the term now is sex worker for what we would traditionally call prostitutes.
Yeah, sex workers. But regardless, the point is, the law is just not really effectual, and it causes a lot of problems for businesses as they are. And the reason this is relevant to just consumers, to users, is that the long-term result could be that the web ends up being dominated by large firms, because having to have a expansive, basically, system of moderating is relatively expensive, and that acts as a barrier to entry into the market. So this could create a system where large firms dominate, and in which they can act as gatekeepers to content creation. And it also creates the basis for a censorship regime, because now, you know, previously you didn't have to have a substantive amount of moderation. You know, it was not legally required, and so you could kind of operate how you liked. You know, some companies argue that's not a good way to operate; it's not an ethical way, but you could do it. And that gave opportunities to people, basically. You know, people who maybe couldn't get past the traditional gatekeepers in the broader media could maybe do something online that they would not be able to do otherwise. But with a sort of de facto censorship regime, with a sort of mechanism in place that allows more expansive, more in-depth moderation, it would be easier to police things like piracy or content in general, basically. And traditional media companies like that. You know, they've always wanted more policing on the internet, and this sort of gives them a foot in the door to do that. And if they can push out smaller producers because of the barrier to entry and leverage the mechanism, the censorship mechanism, so to speak, in order to better police the internet, they would have substantially more leverage and power on the internet and over web content. You know, any and all content on the internet over the long term could end up requiring the tacit consent of the gatekeepers. So that's the downside. That is the long-term threat that is posed by the legislation. And to be fair, some of that may require more action. Some of that is a slippery slope argument, which is actually a logical fallacy. So it's not necessarily the case that this law will inevitably have that long-term result. But that is the possibility. It could. And it especially could if the groundwork is laid for future such action that further erodes the traditional protections for websites as far as legal liability for the content created by their user base. So that's the issue there, basically. I think
Well, one of the things that I would kind of think of as a parallel to online piracy is the notion that in any given sort of area where people are trying to get a certain product, whether that's downloading a movie or sex trafficking, as we're talking about here, there's a portion of the population that wants to kind of leverage minimal effort. And if you're making that process more difficult for some percentage of the population who uses that service, the overall prevalence is reduced. So I think you've been saying it's not going to be effective. Well, you're saying it's not going to be effective in eliminating it entirely, but in some sense there should be a percentage of the demographic that chooses not to participate now that it's more difficult.
Yeah, it will curb the target behavior somewhat. It will have some effect. I'm not saying it won't have any. So you're right in that regard. It will have some effect. But given the cost benefit, you know, given the amount of disruption that's being made, it really is more of a sledgehammer approach. You know, you're making a very targeted you're using a sledgehammer to try to solve a very targeted, finessed problem. And it's generally not efficient. You know, again, I would go back to what I said at the beginning, which is that this is mostly done for show. You know, this is more about politicians trying to do something to say that they did something, rather than to make a real come up with a real in-depth solution to the issue, which could be done. You know, I'm sure there are policies that could address that problem more surgically, more directly. But of course, that's that's subjective. That's a judgment call. You know, the appropriate amount of collateral, not a collateral damage even, but how broad the approach should be, how much collateral damage a given approach to solve, say, sex trafficking should be, is a judgment call. It may be that the sex trafficking, for example, is just so odious, that is such a problem that it justifies such a broad-based sledgehammer approach. On the other hand, you may think the opposite. It may be that you prefer the more targeted approach. I'm just arguing here that it's a very inefficient way to solve that kind of problem. That doesn't mean it's the wrong way to do it. That doesn't mean that you can't support it. That doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. Just that the effect is going to have a lot of repercussions that go beyond just sex trafficking.
Well, one of the historical factors that comes into play here that doesn't for other issues would be that there's a bit of a moral quandary where some people think that sex work should not be allowed, like that it's just straight up an evil of the world and we should eliminate it entirely. Whereas more of the new wave is saying, well, it seems like this service could be provided in a way that is ethical to the parties involved, so how can we make this work? And since the two sides can't really agree on that, then it makes it a lot harder to push policy that helps people involved in sex work if they're an adult sex worker and they're just trying to be safe and do their thing, or a consumer who's trying to kind of set up that consensual adult relationship. So yeah, that makes it very, very difficult. It's kind of a tangled web, and they're trying to make progress on a frontier that's very spicy for people to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a sensitive issue from the ethical and moral perspective. Yeah, there's a lot of strong feelings on both sides of the issue. But it's very difficult to regulate prostitution or sex work, whatever the preferred term may be, sex work. But it's the oldest profession. You know, people who want sex are going to find ways to pay for it, and there's going to be people willing to supply it. It's been around a long time, and it's not going away anytime soon. Do not underestimate the power of the pervert. They will find a way. It does not matter how risky you make it, they will find a way.
Yep, we are animals.
Let's see. What are your thoughts on the long-term viability of utilizing social welfare programs to progress towards a post-scarcity society, if you believe such a thing is plausible, rather? I don't have a lot of thoughts on it, really, because it's still pretty far off. I think it feels closer than it really is because a lot of people who ask that kind of question live in developed countries. And there's been a lot of structural economic changes in that vein that have led to such high productivity that there's kind of a question of what do you do with all these people who are in the services sector. But for most of the world is not really there yet. Most of the world finds that a very alien concept, a very alien problem. You know, there's plenty of people who live, who are mired even in poverty in a myriad of countries around the world. And, you know, for them, it's an academic question. And so long as that's the case, I don't think you're really going to ever quite get there. You know, you kind of have to have everybody involved in order to really make it work, unless you want to have an autarkic type of economy that doesn't really trade with anybody else. But so long as you do, I think it would be relatively difficult. But it's possible. I mean, it gets into it's an ethical question, really, and ethical questions frequently end up being subjective. You know, what is the right and proper form of a society in which you do have enough goods and services and food and whatnot for everybody to subsist on without having more than a tiny fraction of them actually engaged in production of one sort or another. I mean, it's a subjective question. It just comes down to individual preferences. Different people will have different answers. Some people would like a Star Trek type system where, you know, everybody's kind of taken care of and everything is kind of provided and you can pursue your own interest, whatever they may be. Other people probably would not like that. You know, especially I suspect in the United States, there would probably be, you know, the other perspective would be that they should find some new way to work. You know, there should be some other way to continue to have a sort of market capitalist competitive economic system of economic distribution. I don't know how that would work, but, you know, hypothetically there would be some kind of gatekeeping system in which people would not be able to get those resources unless they performed some good or service of some kind that was judged to be sufficient. And, you know, there's a whole spectrum of things in between. I'm sure there's any number of people who've written about it and have all kinds of alternatives. And you know, UBI, Universal Basic Income, is not something I've read a lot about. People keep asking about it, and I keep meaning to read more about it, but I just haven't been able to find the time yet.
Yeah, in my mind, I think of the input-output of how much food we can create for how much humans need to eat on the planet. And it seems like we're in the realm where we could potentially make that happen, but it presents a new logistical problem that we haven't faced before. And then there's also the tradition of, well, people used to have to work to pull their own weight, so that would require a bit of a shift in how we think about how people should spend their time and who should work hard and how people should be rewarded for their efforts and that kind of thing. So it's always kind of that uncomfortable situation where you realize we're about to go through a pretty big cultural shift as a result of how much resource we can create. So what does that mean for us? Like, how should we think about this, and what are the steps to changing that?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You know, it's there's a lot of open questions there. Let's see. Zuckerberg's testimony brought to light a troubling fact that individuals that draft and vote on technology policy in America fundamentally don't understand basic facets of modern tech companies, such as how Facebook can make a profit on ads. I remember that. Is this indicative of a problem with congressmen women being out of touch with modern society, and how can they regulate adequately if that is the case, or is it just a matter of waiting until younger generations get elected? I mean, probably the latter. It probably is just a matter of waiting. You know, there's always a sort of delay between technological change and regulation. And part of the reason for that delay is because congressmen tend to be older folks. They tend to be older, experienced people who've kind of been around, and they get in, and their experience helps them a lot in some ways, but their age kind of makes them unfamiliar with newer issues. And that's sort of what's being manifested, what was manifest at the hearing. So that'll change with time, probably, ideally. But I don't know that the regulatory regime will actually change that much with time, though, because industry has a lot of influence over the regulatory process, and there's a lot of disagreement amongst consumers about what kind of regulations are necessary. So I know there's a lot of people who want more or less regulation about, you know, something like, say, Facebook and data, but unless there's a broader consensus reached in that vein, then there probably won't be substantive change in that regard beyond something really symbolic, like some of the stuff we talked about earlier. Let me see, I think there was multiple parts here. Is this indicative of a problem with, and how can they regulate it adequately if that is the case? They kind of can't. But they have, again, industry has a lot of input there. And, you know, I know a lot of people don't like the idea of industry having input, but a lot of the times they're kind of the experts in some of the material. How can they regulate adequately if that is the case? They get help, basically, from industry, from their staffers, from academics, from, you know, they take input from just about everybody. Anybody who's willing, anyway, to share. So a lot of it comes in, a lot of their expertise that they use in order to design regulations comes from other people. It's not generally the congressmen themselves, especially when it comes to something kind of techie that they're not that familiar with. Can you give your thoughts about the Swedish migrant crisis? How do you predict the state of Sweden will change in the near future in the wake of the population change? Yeah, this is kind of an old issue. You know, the idea that you have new people coming in who are different and they have a higher birth rate and they're just going to take over. They're going to breed themselves into the majority. And it's come up as an issue so many times, and it never pans out that way. It's never happened. I don't think it's ever really happened once, at least not in a major developed country over the past 100 years. Because it was an issue back in the mid-20th century. People were talking about African American. You know, a lot of people in the United States were upset, were worried that the African American population, which had a higher birth rate at the time, would grow to be a significant proportion of the population and perhaps the majority over the long term. And then more recently, there were people complaining about the immigrant population, specifically the Latin American immigrant community, having a higher birth rate and then eventually kind of just taking over, becoming the dominant population group. And you know, neither of these are going to happen, you know, because birth rates change; they're not fixed. They might have a given group might have a higher birth rate than the dominant population at a given point in time, but there's no reason that has to stay the case. And in fact, birth rates generally change. And in developed countries, the birth rates of immigrant communities generally fall over time. And the African American community, not an immigrant community, but it also fell over the course of the mid-late 20th century. So all of those predictions about, you know, substantive demographic change and how it was going to look completely, none of that actually really happened. The needle moved a little bit. You know, African Americans and Latin American immigrants make up a relatively larger proportion of the population than they used to. But the long-term prognosis has not really kind of played out. And I don't think current concerns about Muslims in Europe are going to play out any differently. I suspect that over the next 10, 20 years, as they integrate to some degree or another, maybe even not at all, but regardless, I think their birth rate will fall over time, such that they will probably not become a majority over the long term. I might add here, and this is something we've talked about before, economic development is one of the principal forces that seems to cause birth rates to fall. The mechanism is not really well understood, but if you really want a given group's birth rate to fall for whatever reason, economic development is really the best way to do that. And so really you want to try to encourage people, immigrants, what have you, you know, any given group, to be economically successful regardless of the context. And if that does happen, then people who want that birth rate to fall will be satisfied, because that'll probably be what happens. Developed societies almost all have low birth rates. And so if you want to get people that, if you want to force the birth rate lower, generally it's the opposite case, but for those of you who do want that, integration and trying to push education and economic economic activity, entrepreneurship, what have you, those are the best tools to do that. And those are really the preferable tools, I think, than some of the other tools that such people have proposed. So yeah, that's kind of my take on the immigration issue in Sweden, or if not Europe in general, as well as the United States, and really any country that has a lot of immigrants. You know, the idea that immigrants are just a tide that's going to outbreed the local population, I mean, history doesn't really bear that out. It's almost certainly not going to happen, if it happens at all, like previous such cases. And if they are integrated in any way to such that they share in the prosperity of the nation, and assuming you're a developed nation, you're probably pretty prosperous, then they'll be subject to the same economic and social forces that force down the birth rate of the native population in the first place. Let's see, so that's roughly the take on that. What are your thoughts on China's growing aggression, such as militarization of the South China Sea and alleged reports of plans for a Taiwanese invasion? I haven't heard such reports. I don't hear everything, though. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying I hadn't heard about it. Thoughts on China's growing aggression? I don't think their aggression is really growing. They've been pretty passive. The most aggressive thing China has done is develop islands in the South China Sea, and that's not really all that aggressive in the grand scheme of things. I mean, compared to the Middle East, that's outright tame. Yeah, I mean, the islands were always in dispute, so it's not like they're just taking somebody else's islands. And, you know, some of the islands weren't even really... Some of those islands were submerged, I think, before they started working on them. So developing islands that were have always been in dispute is not necessarily that aggressive. it's an aggressive move generally. It's an aggressive strategic move. That does put more diplomatic pressure on surrounding nations, but it doesn't really change the calculus that much. It would make it more difficult for U.S. naval assets among, naval assets of other nations in general to operate in the South China Sea. That's true. But improving capability to deploy, to project force in a nearby region is not in and of itself an aggressive move, even if it is a disconcerting move. I don't think it's unfair to say, I don't think it would be unfair for neighboring countries, if not also the United States, to push back on China for doing that. I don't think that's unreasonable. But I don't think the Chinese action is so aggressive, so egregious, as to be termed particularly hostile. But that said, within the context of the question, what are my thoughts on China's growing? I don't think it's that aggressive, but in general, they are kind of doing more. They are being more active. So I would not dispute that. And that's just part and parcel of the Chinese government having access to more resources. And that's, the Chinese economy continues to grow, so the Chinese military is going to continue to grow as well, and proportionately, maybe even disproportionately if they start dumping in even more resources into it. And that being the case, they're going to just inevitably have more capabilities in the future, especially as they start to develop their military tech, their ability to project force, their logistics chains. All of that means that China is going to have a lot more capability to influence world events with their military at some point, in the future. So, in so much as you can consider China's actions to constitute growing aggression over the past few years, I would say it's just part of that overarching process of growing capability. In general, I don't think they've been that ambitious. Projecting force in a nearby region isn't really, a very extreme form of projecting force. It's not like they're projecting, a carrier battle group over into the Middle East, and they don't even really have the capability yet. So they're not really influencing other countries any more than they would have otherwise. Maybe some more, but I discount the South China Sea to a degree. I recognize that it definitely does have an influence on neighboring nations, and that the Chinese government is leveraging the South China Sea issue and their presence there to apply diplomatic pressure on surrounding nations. But it's not really military pressure, per se. They're not threatening really to go to war over the islands. They're just threatening, basically, that they're going to seize the islands. The islands in dispute can be seized, and that puts the other country in a position where they either cede them or they have to try to take them back, or, well, basically one or the other. If you don't try to take them back, then you've effectively ceded them. You can complain to an international organization, you can complain to the UN or whatever, but you're not going to get them back probably. Regardless, point is, I don't think it's all that egregious yet. It could be in the future. I think there is some pressure from China in that realm, strategically and militarily, but thus far it's relatively tame. It's still well within reasonable bounds, or shall I say, containable grounds. And I haven't heard anything about an invasion of Taiwan, and I doubt the Chinese government would really want to. It would just create a lot of problems. There would be unrest. They would have to have a large military presence there. It would be expensive. I think we talked a bit about Taiwan 2 weeks ago during the last session, and there's just not a lot of incentive. We kind of talked about it then. There's not a lot of incentive for the party to really go in aggressively like that. China has growing economic leverage over Taiwan, and playing a long game where they just apply more pressure as that leverage grows economically. That's probably the safer route, and it probably would end the same way. The people of Taiwan can resist politically that kind of pressure, but it's going to cost them more and more over time. And it may be that eventually it may be that eventually they just kind of give up and say, all right, fine, we'll agree to some kind of union, or agree to a plan in which there is unification at some point in the future, or some kind of negotiation like that. But a political approach, using political sticks and carrots or economic sticks and carrots in order to kind of coerce Taiwan is a lot more effective, and I think more attractive to the Communist Party of China, than is any military operation. I don't think they see that as being really worth the while. So maybe, again, I haven't read the article or I'm not familiar with the information this person is referencing, so maybe there's just new information that I wasn't aware of. But given what I know now, I would be pretty skeptical that they would try to do something like that. Let's see. Can you describe one or two of your favorite military maneuvers from across history? Perhaps some situation where a battle hinged on a single action. Oh, let's see. That's tough. It doesn't help that I haven't really been thinking much about military history lately. Favorite military maneuver. I guess it would help if I could think of one at all. I guess I could, the one that comes to mind would be Stalingrad. And it wasn't even a successful maneuver, but it was during the Battle of Stalingrad. There was a point in the battle when the Soviets surrounded the city. Basically, the two pinchers north and south of the city closed around the west of the city and met each other. And at that point, General Paulus and the Sixth Army were surrounded, and there was an urgent need to relieve them on the part of the Germans. The Germans wanted to figure out a way to kind of get them out. Goering said that he could keep them supplied by air, but that didn't pan out, and I don't know that anybody on the ground really believed him. So what happened was General Manstein was tasked. I think it was General Manstein anyway. Was tasked with breaking the siege of Stalingrad, basically penetrating that cordon around Stalingrad and opening up a vector through which Paulus could retreat and get his army out. And I think there was one particular general. General Manstein was sort of in charge of the overall operation. Again, I hope I'm not incorrect on that, but there was one guy he tasked with the actual attack, and that guy was named General Hoth. And I think he was a SS Panzer general. And he was a pretty, oh no, I'm thinking of somebody else. Maybe it was Hopper. Regardless, whoever it was, I can't remember the name exactly. He was like a grizzled veteran. He had like, the SS insignia and an eye patch, and he just looked like a guy who'd been fighting on the Eastern Front for a long time, like a stereotypical, German officer. And he was a very good tank commander. And his task was to try to break that siege and get through and relieve the Sixth Army. And he actually almost did it, which was, again, he did it against the odds because he was having to scramble, basically. They really had to mobilize the resources quickly in order to try to kind of break through the siege before the Soviets could build up the cordon, because this was still early on after the pincher movement had succeeded, and the Soviets were still pushing in reinforcements to try to bulk up the forces surrounding Stalingrad. So they needed to move quickly, and this guy actually almost broke the cordon, and he radioed, I think he radioed anyway, General Paulus in Stalingrad and said, look, if you take your forces and push west in the same direction that I'm pushing from, we can meet up. We could probably break the cordon and you can get out. And General Paulus actually refused because Hitler had ordered him to stay in the city and basically to fight to the last man. And if not for that, if Paulus had been given the option, or if he had ignored Hitler and just tried to break the cordon, he could well have broken the cordon and actually gotten his army out. And so I'd always, it was an impressive feat to be able to kind of challenge the Soviets like that, to almost kind of break the cordon and get the Sixth Army out. I'm not saying he should have done that. I'm not saying it was a good thing that he almost broke the cordon. I'm saying it was impressive. Given that the odds were stacked against them, it was impressive that they were able to come as close as they did. I wouldn't call that my favorite maneuver, though. That's just the one that I can remember off the top of my head. I haven't really been thinking much about military history lately. Maybe if I thought more about it, I could think of one. But for now, I guess that's just an answer that I can give. Let's see. Two. Can you describe one or two of your? That's the best I can do for now. Perhaps some situation where I'm seeing what is your? Oh, somebody else asked, what is your favorite major conflict of any kind and why? Probably World War II. That's kind of the one I always go back to. Case in point. Eastern Front in particular was an old favorite when I was in high school. I studied that a lot and have continued to do so off and on since then. Yeah, it's just it was sort of the seminal conflict in human history. It still has repercussions that are reverberating even today. The world we live in is kind of the aftermath of World War II. It changed a lot of things, and not all of the things that changed have reached equilibrium yet. Depending on how you want to argue it anyway. It's all up for debate, but that's kind of my perspective anyway. let's see, I used to be, when I was in middle school, I think I really liked the Civil War. I was a bit of a Civil War buff, so there was that. And then I did in college more Vietnam War stuff. That's kind of off and on. Yeah, I kind of hop from conflict to conflict, basically, just whatever seems interesting at a time. You know, if you do it enough over time, you kind of build up more knowledge. But there's never, other than World War II, there's never been one that I really return to consistently.
So we just got a $20 donation from Shamala Fantôme, who said, "The insight of Agent Smith is appreciated more than he is often rewarded credit."
Well, thank you very much, sir. Much appreciated. Let's see, where was I? To what degree do you view North Korea as a tangible threat, and what steps should be taken to address them? Yeah, we were talking a little bit about this a couple weeks ago too. Like, how do you deal with a state that is trying to develop nuclear weapons, but is resisting all nonviolent efforts to stop them? You know, you can apply sanctions as much as you want, but some states have the capability to develop a nuclear weapon, even in spite of sanctions. And if that's the case, and if they are making that sacrifice, making the sacrifices necessary to develop a nuclear weapon, even in the face of extreme economic sanctions, they're pretty much giving you no other choice but violence. And in that case, and in that circumstance, you kind of have to make the cost-benefit analysis. You know, on the one hand, a general, you know, striking them, trying to stop the nuclear program, could start a conflict, general conflict that would spin out of control, and then you would have, you know, bigger problem. Well, not a bigger problem than a country having a nuke, but you know, it would spiral into a bigger problem than just striking a few sites here and there. You know, it would be more than just airstrikes at that point. And it could create instability in a given region, and there could be fallout over the long term. And you know, you don't know with the nuclear assets they've built up what will happen to them. You know, it could be that North Korea, if the regime collapsed, would just sort of as a last-ditch revenge effort, or even just in the general chaos, a lot of nuclear weapons technology or nuclear weapons themselves could end up on the black market or end up, you know, God knows where. So there's just a lot of uncertainty in that regard as well. So it's just not really clear what the best solution in such cases is, or when we should judge when those cases arise, because of course it's whether a given case represents a situation where a state is going full tilt for a nuclear weapon against, you know, any and all sanctions, no matter what you do. That's subjective too, because you can always argue there are more sanctions you could levy, there's more pressure you can bring to bear, there are more things you can do that don't involve direct military violence. And a lot of, you know, there is that side of it. Maybe there is some sort of magic bullet that would do the trick. Maybe there is some degree of sanctions that have not been reached yet that would coerce them to stop. Or maybe some other type of action that could be taken beyond just military action that would coerce them. But again, you know, the counter argument is, what if there's not? What do you do then? You know, if you're going to have a non-proliferation regime in which it is expressly illegal for states to develop and have nuclear weapons, at least beyond the current nuclear powers, there does need to be some kind of enforcement mechanism. And if given enforcement mechanisms fail, you may be left with no other choice. And again, a lot of that is subjective. You know, it depends on the given situation and circumstances and context and etc. But that being said, you know, there does have to be a judgment call at some point. You know, in the case of North Korea, basically the United States has tacitly said, we're okay with you having nuclear weapons, but we don't want you to develop the capacity to deliver them to target the United States itself. We don't want you to have ballistic missiles that could be used to hit the United States with nuclear weapons. You know, stopping the North Koreans from getting nuclear weapons is not really viable now. You might be able to pressure them into giving up the ballistic missiles, but it would be very, very difficult to give up the nukes because they've already got them, right? You know, so the ship kind of sailed on that. It would have been better to just, you know, I mean, use some kind of action, maybe even direct force 10 years ago, you know, when the program was still in its development phase. But the ship kind of sailed on that. And a lot of the argument by Hawks as far as the Iranian nuclear weapons program, in so much as that's a thing, you know, that's a whole other debate. But in so much as that's an issue, Hawks argue that we don't want to get to a point where we just have no choice but to accept Iran has nuclear weapons. And if we want to make sure that point is never reached, we should act early. And if we're going to act early, we might as well just do it now. And again, I'm not picking a side here. You know, it's up to individuals to determine what they, you know, their perspective on that. They have to make that judgment for themselves, what the situation is, and given the situation, what actions that situation warrants. But those are sort of the respective arguments. You know, those are, I mean, there's more than just two sides to any argument. It's kind of a myth that there is, but roughly, you know, in general, those are the two poles of the argument. The hawkish pole that wants to just strike now in order to prevent a situation where Iran or North Korea can just give you a fait accompli. And then on the other hand, on the other pole, the people who think that we haven't really finished expending all of the other options. We don't know yet whether or not there are options that have yet to been tried or have yet to be innovated that could later be tried that may be effective. Let's see. So do you believe there was a path to victory for Rommel and the German Africa Corps, or was their removal from Africa inevitable? I'm getting into some alternate history here. Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, for one, I should point out I'm not a North Africa guy. I haven't done a whole lot of, you know, most of the stuff on World War II I've done has been more Eastern Front, Pacific Theater, some China, here and there. And I'm familiar with the rest. You know, I've studied Western Front, North Africa, etc., but not in as much depth. So I'm not in as good a position to do a what if type analysis. But what would they have had to do in order? I mean, for one, commit a lot more resources. If they had committed a lot more resources to North Africa, hypothetically, then that could have worked. But that would have been a big investment, because if you're moving a lot of land forces to North Africa, you're not just moving land forces, you're also committing naval assets and air assets. Because keep in mind, the Royal Navy is super powerful. You know, it was very much, it was the dominant naval power at the time. And so if you're going to transport units, you know, equipment, tanks, supplies, men, material, etc., you're going to North Africa, you have to do it over the Mediterranean, and that puts you at risk of have it being intercepted, of those resources being intercepted by the Royal Navy. So you have to commit naval and air assets in order to defend them. And those are naval and air assets, probably more air assets, because the Germans didn't have a big navy during the war. But the commitment of air assets is, those are air assets that are being taken away from someplace else. So they're being taken away from, you know, say the Eastern Front, or taking away from putting pressure on Britain or wherever. There was a time before the war on the Eastern Front in which Germany was just at war with Britain. Maybe they could have dumped a lot of resources then. Instead of focusing on the Soviets, maybe they could have focused on North Africa. And the British probably would have been hard-pressed to really stop such an advance. But if that had happened, there would have been a big temptation for the Soviets to push. Because if the Germans are occupied and have a lot of resources in North Africa, that maybe gives the Soviets an opening. You know, the Soviets don't really want the Germans in the Middle East, Africa, etc. And so having an opportunity to catch them off balance, maybe they would have moved on that. Maybe it's unlikely. I know there is kind of this popular myth that the Soviets actually were planning to go to war with Germany, and that the German attack was a preemptive attack. That's not really true. That's based off of, I think it's off of a book written by a defector in the 80s. And I think the consensus is that he just made a lot of that up. You know, I wish I knew more about the specific case so that I could do more to debunk it, but my understanding is that's a myth. That's basically false. But it may be that the Soviets would have faced that temptation, but maybe not. You know, they were fundamentally kind of risk-averse at the time. And the German, I think the more important factor there would have been that the Germans would have been afraid that the Soviets would have attacked. And in fact, I think I read somewhere that one of the reasons the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, beyond just ideological reasons, you know, anti-communism, Lebensraum, etc., I think there also was a sense in the upper echelons of the German government, if not also the German military, that the Soviets at some point were going to try something. At some point they were going to go to war. And that if that was the case, they might as well try to get in the first shot. They might as well invade first, rather than give up the initiative. So given that fact, it's unlikely the Germans would have ever committed to North Africa. You know, that was probably never in the cards. If they had, they probably would have won. When I say won, I mean they probably would have beaten the British in North Africa, if not also the Middle East, because I don't know that the British would have really been able to leverage. I don't know that the British would have had enough forces really to resist such a big push. But again, I don't think, I mean, strategically speaking, the Germans were just a lot more worried about the Soviets. If they can take care of the Soviets, they can clean up North Africa and the Middle East easily. at least relatively speaking. So it makes sense to focus on the Soviets first. And again, you can try to clean up North Africa and the Middle East first, but then the Soviets are going to come in and attack at a very inopportune time, most likely. That's the German perspective. Again, whether or not the Soviets would have actually done that, anybody knows. Again, it's what if, it's speculation on my part. And it may be that somebody who knows more about the topic than me could kind of contribute more in chat in that vein, kind of clear some of those variables up. But I guess in general, another meandering answer. I guess the short answer to the question, no, not that one. Do you believe there was a path to victory for Rommel? Not really. Not given the resources that he was given and given the strategic objectives of the German government. I don't think it was ever really possible per se. Maybe if a battle here and there had gone differently, they could have taken more territory. Maybe they could have pushed to Cairo if the Battle of Al Alamein had gone differently. There's a lot of what ifs in that regard. But overall, I mean, the United States was probably always going to land in West Africa in 1942. And that fact would have put a lot of pressure on Rommel. So whatever he'd taken, hypothetically, if things had gone better for him, he probably would have lost then. He would have had to shift resources west to deal with that. And the British probably would have regained their losses in the east at that point. He would have needed a lot more commitment from Berlin in order to make it work. And again, either fear of the Soviets or the actual war with the Soviets kind of precluded that. That's my perspective. Again, not an expert. I welcome criticism. Please do add feedback in chat. Are we doing okay on time? Hello?
Yeah, we're good. We got an hour. What was
okay.
Whoops. I went AFK and came back.
No problem. Oh, I saw you in Twitch. I guess there's a delay. Sorry. A little bit of confusion there. Let's see. Is the sound okay this session?
Yeah, there's been none of the robotic stuff as long as I've been around.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I keep checking. I think somebody mentioned that it might be a couple weeks ago that it might be the Discord servers randomly switching to like Hong Kong or something. That might be it. So the next time it happens, let me know and I can try and check the setting here to see if that's what happened.
Will do.
Let's see. I have been reading some. This is the next question. I've been reading some Feynman recently, and he described the writing of commentaries and meta-commentaries as, in many cases, quote-unquote, a disease of the mind, end quote, mainly because commentaries can often stifle novel approaches to old ways of thinking. What is your opinion on this? I would want to read the piece in question before commenting, because that sounds like a pretty complex bit of argumentation, and I wouldn't want to commit to it without really kind of understanding it. I'm not entirely sure how he's using the phrase commentaries here, so I would want to read it first.
If I could guess at it, it would be something along the lines of, by adding a commentary to a text, you're kind of thinking about it for the reader, as opposed to the reader getting to have their own internal commentary as they consume some material, some literature. Because you could say the commentary in and of itself is a new way of thinking, but he's saying that it's stifling thinking, I would guess, for new readers who take the text with the commentary alongside it, which I think is one of those issues of the more people interpret stuff, the less the readers tend to think about it for themselves. There was a little bit of this with the schism in the Christian church between Catholicism and Protestantism, which I was kind of told a whole bunch as a kid. Well, the Catholics, they just think what the priests and Pope tell them to think. They don't think for themselves, but we think about the word on its own. It seems like the same kind of a statement that's being made here, where the commentaries are kind of like the priests and the popes who are the authorities on the matter, and if you're just a lay person and a reader, then, well, you should just trust what they have to say about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that I could definitely see how that would be a problem. I don't know. I I haven't read anything about that particular perspective, so I don't know if there's any kind of data or whatnot, or what kind of research has been done in that vein. But I think in general, yeah, I would agree that, you know, being purely dependent on commentary for your information, basically, it can kind of make you a little bit dependent. You know, it kind of inculcates dependency. You know, if you really want to do analysis and, you know, kind of reach an independent conclusion, you kind of need to focus more on learning the tools with which one can judge situations and then apply those tools, rather than reading something written by somebody else who has those tools and use them themselves. That can be hard to do for everything. I don't, you know, again, I think we've discussed it before. I wouldn't expect everybody to be an expert in everything, but if there is something that you're kind of interested in and want to be, you know, want to be more informed about, certainly reading commentary can kind of get you up to speed to some degree. It can kind of expose you to ideas, argumentation, facts, you know, information generally, basically. But over the long term, you know, you're going to get caught into some kind of bubble probably if you just depend on commentaries. Some kind of objective, independent analysis kind of helps preclude that, mitigate that kind of risk of getting caught in a kind of cognitive trap in which you're sort of afflicted by biases you're not aware of. You know, afflicted by, you know, just information asymmetries and biases that you're not aware of.
Bruce Lee talked about this in the kind of context of martial arts, and how a lot of people will get trapped in the traditional forms of fighting, and they won't really see the space between those forms where it's often appropriate to deviate from a method. So he took kind of a middle path between what Feynman is saying and people who would praise the commentaries of the methods, in that you could practice a method for a while, but once you've mastered it, you should be able to adjust it and make it your own in a way that you're not just kind of blindly following the pattern without thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Turns out Bruce Lee was a pretty smart guy.
Yep.
I'm not saying he wasn't. I mean, obviously, poor choice of words. Yeah, it's a very astute observation on his part, very much in character.
Well, a lot of people don't know that he was a philosophy major at university, so he did a bit more thinking than a kung fu actor, I think, sometimes would.
Mm-hmm. I confess I did not know that myself.
Yeah, University of Washington. He had a bachelor's, so it wasn't like he was super deep in academia, but I think enough to where he realized there were a lot of big questions to think about and take a stab at.
Let's see. But okay, yeah. So I would just kind of defer to Neuro on this, because I think his observations are more pertinent to this. And as far as this person's question on Feynman, I think Neuro's analysis, as usual, is as astute and observant, is better than anything I could come up with in that regard.
Wait, what? Yeah, that question or the next one?
This question.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't think chat appreciates entirely how good a conversationalist you are, Neuro, because you're generally busy playing games and generally can't talk too much. But you know, they don't know. We've had long conversations in the past, and chat should trust me. Neuro can definitely contribute.
I can say words. Yeah, one of the, I think, general skills you can cultivate as a conversationalist is to be able to take in a set of information and just kind of stew on it and try and recognize a pattern within it. Rather than specifically arrive at a conclusion, you try to relate it to what you already know, see how it's new, and maybe gather something interesting about it. A lot of people, I think they want to find that final answer to a question, where a lot of questions, if they're sufficiently complex enough, don't have an existing final answer. So it's kind of like being able to go into the woods and notice something that could be of benefit, as opposed to solving the problem entirely.
I'll give a quick...
Go ahead. For a lot of people, there's a little bit of lack of satisfaction there. They would like to have a complete answer of, oh, this is the roadmap, this is everything. There you go, you're done. Oh, great. That's kind of your conclusion to some of these stabs at a really complex question is you'll say, oh, it was kind of a meandering answer, meaning it wasn't just a straight, like, what's the answer to this? Okay, boom, done, next one.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some questions for which there are no good answers, and in those, you kind of flesh them out and try to give people give them the perspective so that they can kind of judge for themselves.
Or you can go full Deepak Chopra and connect quantum physics and spirituality and genetics all in the same sentence. That's always exciting.
That sounds complicated.
Yep. Well, have we talked about him at all? I feel like we may have mentioned it at some point.
It's fine. I don't recall if we have.
Well, you know how like science has a lot of these outer bounds where we know that we don't know very much about it. He'll kind of find those fringe areas like quantum physics. You're a layperson, even a physicist doesn't fully understand quantum physics. So he'll claim that he's linking quantum physics to some spiritual essence, to the universe, to consciousness, which is a philosophical and psychological frontier that we haven't figured out. And because no one knows definitively about any of these things, then it's really hard to dispute what he's saying, aside from just being like, dude, that's word salad, what you just did. You're just putting a bunch of fancy words together. And then if you challenge him on this, he'll talk about the degrees that he has. So he'll kind of argument from authority himself as a defense. It's really interesting as an example of an extreme version of someone who pitches a lot of really ridiculous stuff and then uses some old strategies for defending those positions.
Well, there's certainly no particular group, be they academics or politicians or whomever, who monopolizes logical fallacies. They get around. Can I give a shout out to the person listening from Chile? I found your little counter thing here that shows the countries from the people listening, and you've got one from Chile.
Nice.
It's a cool country, underappreciated. Very interesting. Thank you for listening.
Welcome. You're being singled out now. Oh, wow. My time has come. I've been recognized.
Let's see. So commentaries can also. Yeah. So the next one was: is the impact of robotization? Is the impact of robotization in industry already big enough to have an impact on the labor force? And then there was an elaboration add-on here. Asks specifically in regards to vehicular automation advancements and how you think society and the economy will react to rendering an entire profession obsolete, such as cross-state delivery of goods. Well, I mean, you're always going to need delivery, unless you have a transporter, so I don't know that that's going anywhere, but I guess it could be automated.
Yeah,
I guess
drones.
yeah, so that's the crux of the question, yeah. Drones, driving cars, although self-driving cars have kind of took a hit recently. You hit a few people and everybody loses their minds. What can you do, Neuro?
Yeah, how many times do human drivers do that?
quite a bit more, I suspect.
I guess the argument that our automated cars hit people less than humans isn't particularly compelling.
Yeah. Oh god, people freaked out about that too. There's a bunch of Terminator memes making the round. Robots taking over. People love to be hysterical.
Yeah, it's fun. There's kind of a timer, I feel. We have our own microcosm with the StarCraft scene where if you have a period of time that passes, people are looking for the next dramatic thing to talk about, and if there isn't one, they'll make one up. It's just the ebb and the flow of, oh, we haven't had that much that's ridiculous, so, well, there's this thing that's kind of dramatic. We could blow this out of proportion. Yeah, let's do this. Okay, great.
Yeah, it sounds like human nature. Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't read enough literature on automation and labor economics, because it would be labor economics. in order to know the exact, the exact degree to which labor is being affected by automation at this particular moment. I'm more familiar with the theoretical arguments as opposed to the actual empirical data on the subject. So I couldn't tell you just how much of an impact it's having right now without kind of digging into the data. And, well, that's a good idea, though. I should write that down. I should know that. That should be something I look into. So impact, automation, labor force, labor economics. Have that in a tab. And then let's see, the next part of the question was elaborating with regard to vehicular automation advancements. Again, without knowing the data, I can't commit too much on it. And how you think society and the economy will react to rendering an entire profession obsolete. That just ties into the previous conversation about what kind of society you want to live in, and if there is post-scarcity. If we have a post-scarcity society, what should it look like? And that again is a subjective question. As for how society will respond to that question, I predict, talked about it before, different countries will have different responses reflecting their respective cultural, political, social preferences, which is kind of a broad answer, I know, but that's about as good as you're going to get. And those, there's so many uncertainties in the future that it's hard to really nail down a prediction in any case. As far as the United States, which I'm most familiar with, because I live here, I suspect that there will be a strong desire and push to try to retain as much of the status quo as possible, at least as far as the system of economic distribution of goods and services. So there will probably be a desire to try to retain at least the facets of a free market system, even if you don't quite have the same substance there. Even if there's not as much need to have certain elements of a free market system, people may try to retain them and kind of try to shoehorn them into the new ecosystem, just because they value that on a subjective level. There's a lot of Americans who are maybe not exactly anarcho-capitalist, but in general, people are relatively for the free market, or at least a regulated free market. There's a growing body of people who are more socialist, but they're still not in enough number to really kind of overthrow the existing system. I don't think the United States is in any danger of becoming like Europe anytime soon. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, again, up to individuals to decide. That has to be decided by everybody by themselves on their own, according to their own preferences and however they make such judgments. Let's see. So how societies will I can't make specific predictions in that vein. For the reasons I outlined, I would be hard pressed to be any more specific than I was with the answer I've given thus far. And I know that's not particularly satisfying, so I apologize. That's the best I can do. Let's see. Then the next one was, and if you want to specify or ask about another aspect of it, perhaps more theoretical aside that I might be more familiar with, feel free to ask, and I can kind of try to approach it again. But the next question was, there is a history of anti-Semitism and pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia in the 19th century. Around 1900, these anti-Semitic fears were roused by public figures to initiate pogroms. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, pogroms. When Hitler and Germans invaded the East, the Jews in the East were heavily prosecuted. Poland has recently passed a law stating that you can be punished for speech stating that Poles were responsible for the Holocaust. What do you think? Yeah, I remember that. Poland is experiencing a lot of its own sort of populist wave right now. It's the same sort of left-right mishmash populist nationalism that pretty much every country is experiencing right now. And part of that has been a lot of frustration. One of the manifestations of that nationalism has been a frustration with people using the term Polish death camps, because there were certain death camps used by the Nazis that were located in Poland, in which a number of Jews were murdered, among other groups. And there's this idea amongst Polish nationalists, and I don't entirely know where they got it, that the phrase Polish death camp implies that the death camps were run by Poles. You know, that they were basically run by the Polish government or occupied government, and that Poles were responsible for killing all of these people in the death camps. And they wanted to specify that Polish death camps does not mean that. And so in order to preclude any confusion on that count, they've made it illegal to basically say anything like, say, Polish death camps that might insinuate that the death camps were anything but Nazi death camps in Poland. That was sort of the genesis of the law. Now, again, I don't really know where that came from, because that, again, living outside of Poland, I don't think that's ever been an issue. I don't know anybody who thinks that the Poles were responsible for the Holocaust. So this, again, as an outsider, this feels a bit like nationalists being overly sensitive, as they frequently do. You can see examples of that in any country. Poland is hardly monopolizing that. But that's kind of what this particular issue feels like. It seems like it's sort of a trumped-up issue created by media or interest groups or whomever, and that politicians are exploiting to kind of win votes. It's more of a sentimental, emotive issue being exploited of the sort of social policy vein that Americans are all too familiar with. But I don't think it has any substance beyond that. And I think Israel sent a representative, and there was a big tiff over it with the Israelis. You know, they were they were rather upset with the law, because they thought it implied that it implied that, you know, there were no Poles who had any responsibility at all. There were some Poles who were involved in the Holocaust. It's not as though every Nazi was German, or that the Nazis had no allies on the continent. But I don't think that fact suggests that Poles in general were responsible for the Holocaust. So I think it's a bit of a stretch. And you know, again, I admit I could be wrong, and I welcome criticism on that count. You know, if somebody is listening from Poland and they have some information that maybe I'm not aware of, please do feel free to share, you know, and kind of give some light on this as to the Polish nationalist perspective on the issue. But that's my impression anyway. It really didn't help matters when that there was one Polish minister who came out and said, kind of, he had a response to Israeli criticism that was very poorly phrased, and the way he worded it kind of implied that some Jews were responsible for the Holocaust. Some Jews were involved in the Holocaust, and the Israelis were predictably upset by that, needless to say, and that kind of made things worse. It was kind of a needless, a needless but inadvertent escalation in the tension. They papered over it eventually. The whole thing was kind of a non-issue, really. It's the sort of thing that politicians have to pretend to care about because nationalists care about it. But given the choice, they would probably just as soon not bother. But yeah, I don't think it's that substantive. It's just part of that overarching sort of wave of populist nationalism that's kind of sweeping through. And it's, you know, of the things that have been proposed by populist nationalists, it's probably one of the more benign. You know, the reforms to the judicial system in Poland that the nationalist government has proposed and passed, actually, were probably are more substantive and more disconcerting. And I recognize that Poland's judicial branch needed reform and that there's a lot of issues there, but the way that they did it and the overarching political environment made it kind of unnerving. There was some reason there. There is substance to the argument that there is substance to the argument that it needlessly aggravated political tensions and that it represented something of a power grab, even if a lot of the reforms were pretty necessary and inevitable over the long run. Again, willing to admit that I might not know all of the facts on that, since I'm not a Poland guy. I don't pay attention to Polish news all the time, so someone from Poland is more than welcome to come in here and kind of elaborate on that. Let's see, and then the last question we had was, what do you think will happen to Julian Assange? With Ecuador getting fed up with him, and will someone else provide him sanctuary, or will he eventually be surrendered back to the U.S. for punishment? I think I remember this question from last week. It was one of the ones we didn't get to, I think. I'm not sure what you mean by surrendered back to the U.S., because he's not an American citizen. He's actually, I think, an Australian citizen. Is that right, Neuro? Are you familiar with his citizenship?
Yeah, I think he's Australian.
Yeah. Pretty sure he has Australian citizenship, and saying surrendered back to the U.S. kind of implies American citizenship. So he's not an American national that can be prosecuted for like treason or something like Edward Snowden or the other guy, what's his name, something Manning, Chelsea Manning. So it's an entirely different legal thing. He would be if he were extradited, he would be charged for under different sort of statutes. It would be something I'm not even sure what they would really charge him with, because releasing military secrets is a high crime if you're an American citizen. But I'm not sure how those laws apply to foreigners. And I would certainly, again, if somebody knows better, is more familiar with those laws, please do contribute in chat. I'm legitimately curious myself, but I don't know how much the U.S. government could really do if Assange was actually extradited to the United States. That said, what do I think will happen to him? I don't know. I mean, the Ecuadorian government has a new government in power. Correa basically retired, left, kind of got kicked out to a degree. That's a whole other conversation. And the new guy isn't as much of a Chavista as Correa was. He's still center-left, I think. More center-left, I think. If there are any Ecuadorians listening, please do educate me as to the new guy's ideology. My impression of the new guy is that he's not as leftist as Correa. But I don't think that it necessarily implies that he's going to give up on Assange and just kind of, let the British government have him. But it just kind of depends on the Ecuadorians. He's been there a pretty long time, and I don't know if he's been there this long. I don't know that there's really that much impetus to get rid of him. I mean, it's not a source of trouble for Ecuador. I don't think anybody's putting a lot of pressure on Ecuador in order to give up Julian Assange. I don't think it's hurting their international relations at all, at least as far as I know. So I think most likely, when things are ambiguous, status quo is generally the safe bet. So I would bet status quo. They'll probably just let him keep staying. I think if he ever leaves, it'll be because he just gets tired of getting cooped up in the Ecuadorian embassy, or maybe he makes a run for it. I don't think he would make it very far, but that's hypothetically possible as well. It probably would not be hard for him to find sanctuary somewhere else. Nothing else, he could go back to Australia. But I'm sure there's any number of interested countries that would be willing to host him. Probably, something like, well, maybe Cuba, but I don't think he would want to go to Cuba. Maybe Nicaragua. It's another Chavista government in Latin America. Or he could go to Ecuador itself. In fact, that was originally what people had been predicting. When he first got holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy, it was kind of expected that he would end up at some point on a plane to Ecuador, and that he would just stay there. So that could still happen, hypothetically. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard much about the story in question. I haven't heard any updates or anything, so I'm inclined to give... I mean, the honest answer is I don't know, so let's just put it at that. That's the most clear-cut, honest answer. I really don't know, and I don't know that anybody really knows at this point. It's kind of up in the air. Let's see, so the next one was, what do you believe were the mechanisms that allowed such high degrees of complicity to Hitler's demands during World War II and the Holocaust? Was it a product of the culture, something related to Hitler's methods, persona in particular, or did he simply do correct things to manipulate people? I don't think he really manipulated anybody. I just think there's a lot of people who are assholes. There's never any shortage of prejudice in the world. And in early 20th century Europe was a messy place. It was not a good place to live for that particular period of time. And that's not universally true. I'm sure there were some good places, but World War I, the Great Depression, and the Great Depression for Europe practically extended into the 1920s. The 1920s was not as bad as the Great Depression in the 1930s for Europe, but the European economies really struggled after World War I. They were not doing great even before the Great Depression. And then World War II on top of that. So it was a really rough and tumble place, and there was a lot of people who were economically dislocated, disaffected, politically alienated. A lot of the same economic forces that are kind of influencing today. Similar such forces were in place at that time. The Second Industrial Revolution was kind of at its tail end at the time, and it was still kind of disrupting established norms, established livelihoods, etc. And of course, there's, again, just a lot of prejudice that makes for easy fodder for populist politicians. Yeah, it was just a general, it was a, I think we've talked a bit about just the general and political environment in Germany at the time, and it was just so convulsed that it was just ripe for some kind of extremism. And we've also talked a bit before about how fascism is kind of a sexy extremist ideology. Of all the extremist ideologies, fascism is frequently the one that comes out on top, because it gives people something to do. Communism kind of expects you to just sit around and maybe plot and do some espionage here and there, but over the long run, it's just a lot of planning and organization, and it's just not that exciting. Whereas with fascism, you get to go out and beat people up. With fascism, you get to go out and attack your enemies, and there's good versus evil. It's very clear cut in that way, and you get to go out and actually not only do something politically, but feel like you're really achieving something in real time. And that's very attractive to people who are not very patient with normal political processes. Normally political change takes a lot of time, organization, patience, etc. But fascism says, to hell with that, let's just take control and have everything be organized by the state in the interest of people who are the best and strongest as we define them. That's inherently attractive to a lot of people, especially people who are not particularly strong or successful. A lot of people on the bottom end of society who feel like they've been cheated from their rightful place in society, for whatever reason. It varies. Some people feel that they've been cheated out of a good job. Some people feel that they've been cheated, because they have a certain race or what have you. Whatever it is, there's a lot of people who think they're entitled to a given way of life, and when they don't get it, whether because of their own deficiencies or whatever, a lot of them will blame other people, and politicians who come along and say, oh yeah, it is those other people. You should vote for me and we'll do something about it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, that's very motivating. That kind of gets you off your ass. And competing ideologies frequently don't do that. They don't offer as easy solutions to complicated problems as fascism does. And so they tend to lose out, especially in times when there's a lot of people who are suffering and a lot of people who are losing out. You kind of see a similar phenomenon after World War II with communism. A lot of the United States and Britain and a lot of Western governments were very worried about communists winning elections in the immediate aftermath of World War II, because Europe was such a mess after World War II. Economic linkages, supply chains, just everything was a complete mess. Everything had been wrecked. Everybody was hungry. There was a lot of poverty. It was just really rough. And I think the famous quote came from, I don't remember the general's name. I think it might have been General Clay, an American general responsible for occupied Germany. But regardless, the quote was, there's no question of voting, there's no question of starving and voting capitalist and having bread and voting communist, something to that effect. I'm mangling the quote, but basically, if people have to choose between starving and embracing an extremist ideology, they're going to embrace the extremist ideology. It's no contest. That's one of the reasons that so much impetus was put on developing the European economy after World War II by the United States, which it had not really originally planned to do. That was actually something new that came about because of the contingencies created by the nascent cold. I'm getting off track. That's a tangent in the making. I'll try to cut it off there. If somebody wants to get into that, we can ask a question about it and we'll talk about it. But to get back to the original question, how did Hitler get so many people to do so many bad things? People have free agency. It's not as though Hitler tricked them into the Holocaust, right? There was a lot of people who were very upset. Hitler gave them some easy solutions to those complicated problems, and he got their support. That's a gross simplification, by the way. I'm sure anybody who studied German politics in the period would be able to illuminate that issue much better than I can. But really, it's not entirely fair to just peg it all on Hitler, which is not something you'll hear me say much. It's not something you'll hear anybody say often. But to be fair to Hitler, it wasn't all his fault. It was a popular movement. There was a lot of people involved in it, and there was also the seizure of power. It wasn't entirely democratic. That even that is a simplification. It's not entirely true that it was like a coup in which they seized power, but they did take power unconstitutionally. Let's put it like that. So even in that case, it's not entirely fair. But you could argue then, if it was unconstitutional, why was there not a response? Why did the other people who were not Nazis kind of band together, whatever their differences may be, and try to stop the Nazis from seizing power after they did? And the answer is kind of twofold. For one, the institutions were not strong enough. Keep in mind that by 1939, German democracy was only, 20 years old? I mean, the Weimar Republic was created after the fall of the Kaiser, and that was only 1920, something around there. I guess 1918 is the intuitive answer. That was when the war ended. But regardless, democratic institutions in Germany in the interwar years were not strong. They just had not had time to develop, and a lot of people were very skeptical of them anyway. Germany had been a very conservative society. And it's not as though a conservative society that is somewhat authoritarian, it wasn't completely authoritarian under the Kaiser. They did have some democratic institutions. But it's not as though a conservative society with authoritarian institutions suddenly becomes a liberal progressive society when it has democratic institutions. You know, that conservatism stays on, and conservatism in Germany were critical of liberal democracy, as well as a lot of people on the radical left. So there just was not a strong constituency in the middle of people who were liberal Democrats who wanted to kind of make those institutions stronger over time. Rather, those institutions were basically discredited, and you know, most people were just kind of fighting over how to dismantle them in one way or the other. I don't know that German democracy really had a long-term future in the 1920s and 30s. It was kind of on borrowed time in a lot of ways. That doesn't mean it was inevitable that the Nazis would take power, but the institutions were just not strong enough to really stop either the Nazis or whatever group ended up kind of trying to seize power from doing so. So that was a big part of it. That was a big part of how Hitler was able to seize power and later perpetrate the Holocaust. And then the other problem is that there was just, well, kind of like I was just saying, there was no coalition that could be built. I mean, there was just no unity of purpose amongst the other dissident groups that were not Nazis. You know, there was no like grand anti-Nazi coalition that could be formed. There just was not there was not enough of a sense of danger about the Nazis, nor was there enough in common between the groups in order to kind of unite them together. They were just too divided, and in that way, it just wasn't feasible. It just couldn't really emerge. It couldn't happen. Again, this is my impressions. I'm not an expert on, you know, Nazism and German mid-20th century history. This is what I remember, and my memory is not perfect. It's just what I'm able to kind of conjure up at the moment. So those are some of the mechanisms. Was it a byproduct of the culture? Partly. Something related to Hitler's methods? You know, again, partly. It's just kind of the politics. Or did he simply do the correct things to manipulate people? Again, don't really think it was manipulation. I don't really think it was entirely manipulation. There's a lot of other factors there, like I just said. I think I covered all of the aspects of the question. If I didn't, please feel free to kind of ask again and kind of point out what I'm missing here. What are your thoughts on trying to institute legislative change bottom up? A law change of public consciousness, law eventually changed to reflect new public consciousness, as opposed to top down. Let me see. I think this is also one we had last week that we didn't get to. Change of public consciousness. Oh yeah. Bottom up is better. Well, let me preface this by saying it's kind of a subjective question, because you're kind of asking me what my personal opinion is about the dynamics in question. Well, I guess you were asking for thoughts, so I guess that could be objective. But the question's wording lends itself to a subjective answer, which I try to stay away from as much as possible. Not always great at that. You know, if I'm ever unduly subjective in answering a question, I do humbly request chat pointed out so that I can not do that in future. I do want to try to be as objective as possible so that I can be as inclusive as possible. But thoughts on bottom up versus top down? I'm inclined to think that bottom up is the best because it's easier. I mean, the legislative change is generally designed in some way to induce some behavior or stop some behavior, depending. But it's a lot easier to do that if you can just get everybody to agree to do it or not do it, in which case you don't even necessarily need the law. The trouble with the bottom-up approach is that it's really hard to convince any large group of people to agree on anything. You know, I hate to dredge up the same analogy over and over again, but you know, it's hard to get even like a group of 10 people to agree on what to get on a pizza, let alone to get an entire society of millions of people to agree on, you know, lofty political issues of one sort or another. So it just gets more complicated the more people there are, and in that way, the bottom-up approach is difficult to do. You know, it requires an organized, dedicated campaign over the long run in order to make that work. Top-down approach is nice because it's a lot easier. You just need to get the law passed, and it may be that, you know, you can, through whatever political machinations or circumstances may arise, you may find that you know, you have the opportunity and are able to get it done. And in that, you know, generally there are fewer players kind of to deal with. There's a lot fewer politicians than there are citizens. So if you can kind of get them to impose the change on society by the passage of a law, you might be able to get the change you're looking for that way. But the trouble with that is that you're imposing it, right? There's a lot of people who might disagree with you, and they're not going to be particularly happy about having to deal with a law that they don't agree with. They might nominally pay it some attention. They may give it some deference, but they may only do the bare minimum. They may do the bare minimum just enough to not get arrested, basically. Drug laws are a good example. Marijuana is technically illegal in a lot of places in the United States, but a lot of people smoke it, so people still do it, but they just don't do it in a particularly open way in which they could easily be arrested for it. So clearly the law is flouted pretty regularly. And that's kind of an example there of how laws can be pretty easily ignored. That's not a particularly enforceable law. Laws are it's frequently very difficult to enforce unpopular laws. Let's put it like that. And because of that, it's, for that reason, the top-down approach here that you mentioned here is not generally that effective in the long run. In the short run, you might see some quick change, but frequently it's superficial. It's just people changing their behavior rather than what they believe. And if you don't change what they believe, then probably the negative consequences of their behavior that you're trying to curb will manifest in other ways, in behaviors that you don't see. You kind of drive it underground rather than having it be out in the open where you can kind of see it more readily, measure it, and challenge it. So my personal opinion is that the bottom-up approach is more effective, and that's probably what people should focus on more. Maybe if there's like an emergency or a particularly egregious issue at hand, maybe the top-down approach is justified in those cases. But what constitutes egregious or what constitutes emergency, some of that is kind of subjective too, isn't it? So that's kind of playing with fire, because then you could easily subjectively come to the conclusion that something deserves a quick short-term solution that justifies a top-down approach, but then have massive opposition that ultimately just, and that way the change would just serve to destabilize society. So it's kind of a judgment call. It's kind of how much do you believe a given issue is deserving of change? How important do you think it is? How right do you think you are? I would be a little cautious of anyone who says that they're absolutely right and that whatever they think is right deserves massive government action. You have to be very wary of that. But if you feel that way, if you do feel that way, that would justify more of a top-down approach. But if you're more patient, and if you do want more substantive change that actually percolates more over the long run and actually becomes more effective over the long term, that would suggest more of a bottom-up approach. Again, I'm open to criticism on this, and feel free to do so. I'm not familiar with the literature on this particular topic, so I may be talking out of my ass a bit. Let's see. So that's the last question we have then is the term, well, the last question for now anyway. The term copyright colony has been used to describe countries which are induced through various means to uphold U.S. copyright laws, for example, New Zealand and Kim.com. With the U.S. seemingly adopting a more insular stance, should we expect the size of this domain to shrink? Huh. It's an interesting question. Now, let me think about that for a minute.
Thank you very much, Dorak. We just got $50 for you. Some love for Agent Smith. Neuro is kind of cool too.
Thank you very much, everyone, and this person in particular. Donations are certainly appreciated. I could definitely use the money. Did you hear that question, Neuro?
The copyright colony?
Yeah. I mean, I would expect that if the United States does become more isolationist, more insular, that intuitively would lend itself to less pressure on other countries to adhere to U.S. copyright laws, since the U.S. pushed for those laws kind of as part of a free trade regime. The U.S. wanted more access to other markets and wanted more intellectual property rights in those markets, so that its intellectual property firms like, you know, the movie industry or tech firms or whatever, could operate there and turn a profit without having their IP stolen. So I would think if the U.S. is pulling back from that kind of free trade perspective, that intuitively it would put less pressure on, say, New Zealand to try to enforce intellectual property provisions. On the other hand, you could argue that enforcement of intellectual property provisions is not a matter of free trade, that the internet is kind of a special dimension in and of itself, and that the United States will still push hard for other countries to respect intellectual property provisions, specifically U.S. copyright law, so that the United States can continue to, so that the U.S. government and U.S. industry can continue to operate. Well, I shouldn't say government, but so that U.S. firms can continue to operate overseas and enjoy the protection of their intellectual property. So in that case, so in that sense, you could argue either way. And if I had to guess, I would say that the U.S. government would probably still pressure countries to adhere to intellectual property law. Nominally, the Trump administration is not necessarily anti-free trade so much as it is anti-unfair trade. At least that's what they keep saying. They might push for bilateral agreements, and I think this is what they've said they're going to do. They're going to push for bilateral agreements with other countries, and I imagine the U.S. government will push very hard in those agreements, as it usually does, for greater intellectual property protections in the counterparty country. So I would guess even if the United States, in general, broadly speaking, becomes more insular because of you know, Trumpist-style isolationism, if you can call it that. I'm not sure whatever term you want to refer to that by. So the general withdrawal of the United States from world affairs, if indeed it is doing so at all. That's a whole other discussion. But if it does so, I think it will still pursue and pressure other countries to improve intellectual property protections, just because that's a big part of the U.S. economy, you know, tech sector, Hollywood, etc. And I think the U.S. government kind of feels that it's in America's interest, in pursuit of opening up more markets, export markets, etc., to try to push for that in other societies. So I suspect there will be more of that. Basically, it won't end. I hope I'm getting the crux of the question right. I'm not that familiar with copyright issues, so I'm probably missing some details or some of the technical aspect of the question. I apologize if so. Let's see. Why is it that federalism is not more widespread among world nations, speaking to its appeal rather than its efficacy? Federalism is not popular amongst nationalists, and you know, federalism, you know, for those who aren't familiar with it, federalism just means a decentralized government in which there's nominally a strong central state, but in which sub-state entities like provinces or states or what have you have a lot of authority, have a lot of autonomy. So Texas, for example, largely runs its own affairs, but it does have certain obligations and rights vis-a-vis a much larger overarching national government. This as opposed to a strong central government that rules more or less directly over all territory. So if the United States had a centralized government, it would not have, instead of a federal government, the government in Washington would have basically a direct line of control, a direct hierarchy into Texas governance, instead of Texas government being kind of a separate thing. So why isn't that more popular? I mean, it would probably be better if it were, because decentralized political systems lend themselves to being more flexible and to giving more room for different interest groups to kind of pursue their interests without getting in each other's way. And as generally there's less bureaucracy as well. But I think a big reason it's not as popular in general is that it's kind of seen as a threat by a lot of people. You know, if your country has strong centrifugal forces, like a separatist group, where there's a lot of regional differences, especially differences defined by different ethnicities, there may be a sense that having anything but a strong centralized government could create centrifugal forces that are too strong for a federal government or more decentralized government to handle. So there's kind of a fear that the government, that the state, that the country could fall apart if the government is not sufficiently centralized and strong. So that's kind of the argument against federalism, that I suspect would frequently crop up if you talk to people. Another problem is that a lot of countries are too small for it. I mean, if you're basically just a tiny territory, or even a mid-sized country, there's not as much need in that case to have to have a federal structure, to have a lot of autonomous subnational entities kind of governing their own affairs. There is a point of diminishing returns in which you're giving too much autonomy to too small a set of territories, wherein it becomes kind of obtrusive. Those autonomous territories can fight with each other, basically compete with each other unnecessarily, squabble, basically. And the national government may be sufficiently hobbled that it can't really take care of its responsibilities. A small territory is probably better served by a central government in such cases. It's just, again, it's just more efficient. There's not as much need for a federal system. Now, if you're a small country but you have substantive ethnic differences and ethnic conflict, or maybe different regions that have substantially different economic interests, maybe in that case you should have a federal system. That's an example. An example of that would be like Belgium, where you have, and I think we have some Belgians listening. Even I would encourage them to contribute here to kind of correct me on this if I'm getting it wrong. But in Belgium, you have Flanders, which is more of the Dutch territory in the north, and then you have Walloon in the south, which is the French-speaking territory. And the two territories do not always get along. They have different perspectives, different preferences on a lot of issues. And so in that case, having a federal system that kind of separates them, segregates them to a degree politically, and in terms of regulations, that kind of helps keep the country together because it kind of mitigates tensions. Although tensions still have run high. I think Belgium has the record for longest time without a government. There was I think a year and change where the Flemish and French parties in Belgium couldn't agree on a new government, and so Belgium just kind of had to go with a government pro temp, a temporary government, for again a year and change. It was a long time. Again, any Belgians listening, I apologize if I'm offending you. Please correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong.
I'm ethnically part Flanders.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I got that on my heritage test. My mom's adopted, so she didn't know what she was, but she is predominantly Flemish, Flanders, that kind of area.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a kind of unheralded part of Europe.
Well,
generally...
We got a book, and it seems like they've been kind of squished between a lot of really powerful forces.
Yeah. Yeah, they definitely have. Yeah, the Dutch, I think, kind of monopolize that identity, basically, the Netherlands and the Dutch identity. I don't think it just, for historical reasons and media reasons and whatnot, the Dutch in Belgium, the Flemish, they just haven't been able to get as much of that. And they're kind of either lumped in with the Netherlands or they're just forgotten. So it's unfortunate. It's actually a relatively wealthy region. I think it used to be the other way around. I think actually the French part of Belgium used to be wealthier and then the Flemish part was poorer. And I think that was because heavy industry in Belgium was more in the southern French area. But then basically Belgium was subject to the same forces everybody else was. Heavy industry kind of died out over time. It became uncompetitive because of, automation, free trade, whatever, regulation, a lot of different factors went into it. And so heavy industry in Belgium kind of withered over time. Meanwhile, the Flemish part of Belgium kind of took off because they had a more open economy that was able to kind of exploit the opportunities provided by the information boom, or the information age, rather. So there's more tech companies and, high-paying services jobs and industries in the northern Flemish part of Belgium now. And so that part of Belgium is relatively wealthier. I think that change happened roughly over the course of the 70s and 80s. If I'm remembering correctly, I could easily be getting that wrong, though. Again, Belgians encouraged to contribute in chat. But off the top of my head, that's why federalism is not more popular. It's seen as it's not considered safe, basically, in a country where there's strong centrifugal forces. A lot of people are opposed to it. I know that's kind of counterintuitive because I just said that countries with ethnic differences could find it as a useful tool, but some countries are not willing to take the risk. Some countries don't trust the different ethnic groups or interest groups or what have you in a given country to use the autonomy given in federalism responsibly, that they would still be loyal to the state. They think that they would take that autonomy and just push for independence. They kind of run for it. Different countries have different circumstances, so it varies from country to country. But in general, that's my impression of the logic against it. What do you believe is the best approach to mitigating gerrymandering in the US? And conversely, how can abuse of false gerrymandering claims be dealt with, such as treating it as slander/libel? I don't think that'll ever be treated as slander/libel. That would be a free speech problem. That would be a big free speech problem. So that would probably be unconstitutional. I doubt they would go that route. But I get the crux of the question: what do you believe is the best approach to mitigating gerrymandering in the US? I don't think there's ever going to be a really good approach to it. It may be that the only good approach is just having a proportional system so that you don't have to worry about gerrymandering in the first place. But proportional systems have their own problems. And you know, it's not going, you know, some people want proportional systems because they want them, because they think that'll induce political change, break a deadlock or break equilibrium, and induce a more favorable political environment to their preferred ideology, whatever it may be. And I think that's frequently not the case, unless you have a grossly unrepresentative, misrepresentative political electoral system. Probably it wouldn't change that much. I think that's probably the case in the United States, although again, I would welcome criticism on that grounds. Regardless, I'm getting off on a tangent again. I don't know what the best approach would be, and again, it may be that there's just not a good solution to it that satisfies everybody. You know, gerrymandering is kind of subjective in a way because there's no real set rule book for how to best set districts. You know, because you kind of have to prioritize certain things. Do you prioritize voting pattern? Do you prioritize ethnicity? I mean, do you prioritize urban versus rural, rather? Do you prioritize region by economic activity? There's a lot of different ways that you can design a district, and which way you go with is inevitably going to alienate one group or the other. So I think somebody will always be pissed about how districts are designed, and as a result, there's always going to be gerrymandering accusations. Can we design a system where districts are designed to in a less clearly biased way, in a way that's less clearly designed to bias towards certain parties? That was a grammatical nightmare. I couldn't quite pull it off. So you get the idea. I'm sure we could make the problem less severe. Let's put it like that. I'm sure there are measures that could be taken in that vein, but I don't think there's ever going to be like a good, clear way to do it in a way that completely removes any doubt as to whether or not a district is gerrymandered. The way districts are designed are invariably going to favor some kind of group in some way. I think the question now is, can we create a system that is more representative? Can we create a system of districts in which proportions of groups are more accurately represented in the distribution of seats in legislatures at the state, if not also national level? Probably more the state level, since that's where most of the legal battles are happening. And I think that should be feasible. But the trouble there is that you have to define group. Like right now, Democrats are underrepresented in certain Republican states, or rather states that are dominated by Republicans because of redistricting that favors Republicans. Similarly, there are Republicans who are underrepresented in states that are dominated by the Democratic Party. Similarly. So how do you kind of rejig those systems so that the minority parties have more representation, where representation is more fair? The thing is, it's kind of arbitrary to just decide that Democrats and Republicans are the criteria. You could break it down into interest groups. You know, you could say, all right, generally, people who vote for Democrats are people who are living in cities, you know, off the top of my head, cities, students, etc. So you could look at groups, you could design districts based on those sub-criteria. Find districts that are mostly students and just have that be a district. Design a district to have an area that is mostly students, and then look at another area and have that be mostly another group or what have you. So I guess the point is that just designing a system to have more representation for one political party or the other kind of glosses over the fact that the political parties are umbrella institutions that encompass people of many different backgrounds and interests, and that designing districts around them might be better, but might also not result in more representation for Democrats or Republicans. It just depends on how you want to define gerrymandering and what the goal of gerrymandering reform is. And you're going to get different solutions depending on what the answers to those questions are. Again, I'm definitely not an expert on gerrymandering. I'm not a political scientist, and I would, could easily be wrong. We've talked about this before, and I got bitched out when I was talking about proportional voting systems and why I was critical of them. So I won't commit too much on this because I recognize that my background is not favorable to. It does not lend itself to a strong commitment there, a good, strong, fervent answer. But that's off the top of my head. This is my understanding of it. Let's see. Also curious about opinions regarding the ability to target down to a much smaller level via big data analytics. Yeah, it's possible. You can target, I mean, with big data, if you have enough information, you could more accurately carve up a territory into territories dominated by one group or one type of group or another. But even there, it's tricky. I mean, what do you do with something like, say, a metropolitan area? Because in metropolitan areas, everybody's all mixed up. You might be able to divide them according to income. Generally, cities have like poor areas, wealthy areas, etc. But then there are subgroups within them, right? So then within the wealthy area, you might have a lot of lefty-leaning students, and then you might have a lot of righty-leaning conservative business types. If you lump them all together in a single district, you know, that district would be competitive, but maybe then some of those people would feel they're not getting representation. They're getting fair representation. So how would you deal with that? How do you deal with areas where everybody is kind of intermixed and where there is no clear geographic area that you can really draw that would clearly give a district to a particular group? That's a difficult question. And then again, you know, the issue of something like economic interest. You know, do you just clump all of the rural areas into one giant district on the presumption that they're all the same? Well, what do you do if they're not all the same? Texas, for example, has wide, you know, huge areas that are rural, but that are also diverse. You know, there's a big, you know, southern Texas, for example, is mostly rural, but it's also mostly Latino. Mexican. It's probably Mexican would be more accurate. Some people get sensitive about that. Whatever you want to call that. They're Hispanic American or what have you, Latin American.
I think Latino.
Let's say. Let's go with Latino. Most of the population in southern Texas is rural and Latino. So if you clump all of Texas's rural areas all together into one or a couple of districts, you're also kind of denying representation to that group, right? Because I think there's relatively more Anglo people living in rural areas in Texas than there are Latino. And so if you clump all of them together, the Latino rural people may feel they're not getting enough representation. Now you could divide up the rural areas according to both race and you know, economic interest. You could have, you know, rural Anglo districts and rural Hispanic districts and then rural student districts in cities and what have you. But then you're proliferating the districts and you only need so many, right? So what do you do then? You only have so many seats, but you have, you know, umpteen districts. How do you kind of resolve that issue? So it gets more and more complicated the more targeted you want the districts to be. You know, the more targeted you want to be, the more judgment calls you have to make as to how they're constituted. On the other hand, the other problem is if you're going to aggregate districts, if you're going to have a lot of people lumped together, what kinds of combinations do you have? Because invariably when you do that, some subgroup or another is going to be marginalized. So kind of who gets marginalized basically in that case. It's not an ideal it's not an ideal problem basically. A proportional system would help deal with that, but again, has its own problems. I just don't think there's any one good solution to that. Big data would help, but you wouldn't, you know, if you use big data to try to do that, you would still face the same judgment calls. And it's those judgment calls that are the problem, because that's sort of the locus of disagreement, right? Whatever judgment call you make is going to piss off somebody, and then you're right back to where you started, where you have a large minority group of one sort or another claiming that underrepresentation and demanding reform.
Just got another donation for you. Fuzzy Cord donated 25.
Oh, thank you very much, Fuzzy Cord.
Thanks to Agent Smith for the enlightening discussion. I always look forward to it.
Oh, kind words, much appreciated. Let's see. When pressed about the ability for foreign agents such as Russia to manipulate America indirectly via data gleaned from American companies, Zuckerberg agreed that he would be in favor of theoretical legislation to restrict and control how private companies manage data. This speaks to a larger precedent of the line that needs to be drawn of how the government can regulate private industry for the sake of national defense. Do you think the U.S. is in a stage where this legislation is required, and what should be the extent of its reach? What should the extent of its reach be to account for how modern companies operate? It's a deep question. Let me think about it here. The degree to which the current environment, commercial environment, national security environment, etc., overlap, to which those environments overlap, necessitating a stronger role for government in regulating industry in the name of national defense, is subjective. That kind of in itself requires a judgment call, because it's not really easy to delineate what the difference, where the lines are there. You know, where do you draw the line between something that is the realm of the private sector and something that you just have to allow risks to occur in, as opposed to something that is in the sphere of national security and that does require action by the government. You'll get a lot of opinions on that depending on who you ask. If you ask 10 different people that, you'll get 10 different answers. My perspective has been that the idea that Russia, kind of bought the election or swayed the election is not true. They probably influenced it. Well, they certainly influenced it to some degree, but my perspective is that that degree is not substantial. I doubt that Russia was able to really swing the election just by putting memes on Facebook, basically. That's my criticism.
What if they were really dank memes, though?
Even if they were dank memes.
Wow.
And I know that they did some activity beyond that. I know that there were some rallies that were organized by some Russian groups, but those rallies were not manned by Russians, right? They were Americans. So the Russians did not do anything in the United States that political actors in the United States were not already doing, and doing more of and more effectively. Whatever kind of agitprop the Russians were doing in the election, the Democrats and Republicans were doing way more of it. If you look at the memes and the actions taken by the Russians, it's nothing that a public relations company or a political party would not already have been doing. So I'm not convinced that it really added that much to influence the election in any way, in any substantive way.
From my perspective, it seemed like the biggest shot in the foot was the Democratic Party not having unity between the Bernie and Hillary camp. Like, when Hillary won the primary, the Bernie supporters weren't very enthusiastic about voting for her, just because of how different they were, and also a lot of Bernie supporters felt betrayed by the DNC, like very clearly favoring her leading up to it. So that, I would guess that was a bigger factor than the Russian dank memes, dank as they may have been.
Yeah, that's probably the principal overarching factor. I think I would agree with you. That's probably the biggest determinant there. I mean, people were just so upset with Hillary Clinton, the establishment candidate. Trump was just relatively more attractive for enough people that he was able to kind of swing the election his way. And the Bernie people were kind of a part of that. They were sort of the disgruntled leftists who either didn't come out to vote or flipped for Trump in a lot of cases, at least as I understand it. And I might add that schism hasn't gone away. That schism is very much still there. And I think if Trump gets reelected in 20, that'll probably be why. It'll be because that schism has not really been dealt with sufficiently. And that's a very real possibility, because there hasn't really been a lot done, as I perceive it, on the part of the left to kind of deal with that. Let's see, so that's... Well, the overarching point I wanted to make with regard to the question was there's been a lot of mission creep on the part of the national security apparatus in the United States, if not in the West generally. The notions of national security are kind of expanding to encompass areas that it had not previously. So something like cybersecurity, for example, kind of represents that sort of mission creep. Like the idea of cyberspace as a field of battle in which the military needs to operate in. That's kind of a weird, abstract idea that's kind of emerged over the past 20 years. And it's not, I mean, I can see it how it happened organically, but it's still an odd fit. I mean, a lot of the things that the national security apparatus in the United States is upset with, like Russian meddling in the election, like cyber espionage, you know, people stealing secrets from government networks or economic secrets over commercial networks. A lot of that kind of thing is not really in the purview of national defense per se. Historically, that's been the purview of either intelligence / espionage or the private sector. That's not new. And I don't know that it's really healthy to have the military entirely invested in these things. You know, police institutions, to some degree intelligence institutions, those I think are the more appropriate institution to deal with something like cyber espionage or election meddling, such as it is. That's more the appropriate venue. And you know, I'm not completely dismissing the idea of election meddling. Obviously, people have to judge for themselves the degree to which given actions represent meddling by another country in their elections, because that is a serious issue. And you know, again, the degree to which you think that's serious and what you want to do about it, that's subjective. That's up to individuals to determine for themselves. But my criticism here is that the military is not the appropriate institution to deal with that. And it represents a kind of mission creep, that they're kind of expanding into these areas that are more the areas of traditional politics or other agencies. And the military has been expanding for quite a while in that regard. You know, cyberspace makes some sense. I can see that. I would personally prefer if it were in another institution. You know, maybe something like the CIA or NSA or something like that. But the military itself, I don't think quite fits for it. And I recognize that the NSA already has a lot of it, but it could be narrowed down a bit. But expanding it into something like election meddling, I think, is risky. Because one of the big advantages the United States has had over its history is that the U.S. military does not get involved in politics. And it's kind of getting closer and closer to getting involved in politics in the way that it's defining national security. Basically, the broader the definition of national security, the easier it is to justify intervention into something that really should just be in the political realm. And so right now it's not as big of a problem, but that's kind of the trajectory. You know, things like terrorism are a good example. There is no definition of terrorism, really. It's basically just anything you don't like. And if that's the case, then that kind of gives national security actors an excuse, a rationale to intervene in things that they would not otherwise be able to intervene in, on the justification of terrorism of one sort or another.
I can't tell you, but I know it when I see it.
Exactly. So, you know, cyber espionage, terrorism, etc., all of these things, election meddling, all of these things could be defined in a way that justifies military involvement or intervention. But the more discretionary power you give to them to do that, the more temptation there will be to abuse that power in ways that the power was not originally intended to be used. And given how much the American public trusts the military, like it's the most trusted institution in the United States right now, but certainly amongst any government institution, there may well be a temptation in future to kind of let them do that, which opens the door to things like juntas and coups and lots of nasty things that are very difficult to unwind once they're out of the box. So I'm a little critical then when this idea of the military needing to get involved with issues like this, of the national security apparatus in general really getting involved with it, that kind of sets off an alarm bell for me. Now, I'm editorializing to a degree. Again, this is up to your individual discretion to determine. You know, whatever you think, what action is justified, the degree to which the military national security apparatus should be involved, that's up to the individual to determine, and I'm not going to tell you one way or the other what to believe. You know, I'll sometimes share my opinion. I try not to. Sometimes I slip into it, but in general, that's my impression of it. And yeah, it's a judgment call again, like I've been saying. But I'm just a little skeptical, and regardless of what you think of it, I would warn about that. there are long-term consequences to giving the military, if not any institution, a lot of discretionary power that is ambiguously defined. That would be my warning then. I'll leave it at that. Oh wow, I really went off on a tangent there, didn't I?
Tangents are fun. That's what we do.
I guess that pretty much covers it. I don't think that a lot of legislation is really needed to stop data getting into the hands of the Russians, because they're going to get it one way or the other, basically. You know, it's a free market in data, and I don't think having the data gives them any capability to like shape the American public. You know, I don't even think that political parties really do that all that effectively. You know, people spend a lot of money on political campaigns, but it's kind of a high-cost, low-return activity. You don't want to not do it, because not doing it gives an advantage to your opponent. You know, there is some advantage, and you don't want to just let your opponent have that advantage without any counter. But the fact that both parties don't want the other party to have that counter, that doesn't mean that they are getting a lot of return on their investment. Again, it's just game theory. They're spending a lot of money to do very little, just so that they can eke out a small advantage over the other party, just in case it ends up being a close election and a small number of votes ends up winning it. So in that sense, I'm not really convinced that there's a big need to really legislate how data gets passed around and used. You can legislate how data is gathered. You can legislate something like consent, so that people have more control over that. You can control over, you have more regulations about who you sell to and who you don't sell to. You know, in that case, yeah, you might pass a law that says you can't sell to Russia, or you can't sell to some company or some type of company or what have you. But I don't think it would have a big impact on national security. Because again, if you did pass that law, Russia would just hack it and get it anyway. They hack, you know, I'm not saying they hack everything, that they're guilty of all the hacking accusations that have been levied against them, but they do have the capability. You know, Russia has a lot of smart people who are good with computers. I don't doubt that the Russian government has leveraged at least a few of them in order to build up some kind of cyber capability. So certainly if they wanted that data, they could get it. That's the thing about cyber espionage. Spies frequently don't really give a shit about your country's laws. Kind of a meandering answer. I'm sorry if I didn't get to the crux of it. If there's an aspect you want me to touch on, you know, kind of ask again and focus on that, and I'll try to get back to it. My brain is all over the place on that one. Let's see, how does Ayn Rand's philosophy apply to the current situation between the Democratic far-left policies and the Republican conservative values? How do you view Ayn Rand? I don't think Rand applies at all here, because Rand was very much more of an anarcho-type capitalist type person. That was more her perspective. More liberty, more freedom, less regulation, less government burden, to an extreme degree, like extreme individualism, basically. And very little of that, really, right now. You know, the principal political forces in the United States, at least the ones that are the most energetic, are the far left, which is innately collectivist, and then the far right, which is also collective. You know, they're sort of two sides of the same coin in that way. There is more of the traditional sort of liberal laissez-faire ideology in the middle, but I don't think very many centrists would consider themselves Randists. It's generally more of a far-right thing, and the far-right, you know, there are still a lot of people in the far-right who probably would consider themselves anarcho-capitalists in the Randist vein, to some degree, but they've kind of been swamped by the populist wave that's come through. And I actually do remember reading about a lot of people on the right being uncomfortable with a lot of the new populist-type people that were kind of flooding into the party and supporting Trump. And that actually swung the primary, the Republican primary, was a great example of that, because a lot of traditional conservatives, including far-right conservatives, supported a number of various conventional candidates of one sort or another. And then here comes Trump being propped up by this populist wave of people who have not previously really been in the party much. And it was a little bit uncomfortable for a lot of old party people. You know, you can see that even now with how uncomfortable establishment Republicans are with the Trump administration. You know, they don't really entirely seem to know how to deal with them. A little bit, you know, sometimes it's even a little bit entertaining to watch, because you can kind of tell through their statements that they want to say something, but don't really feel that they have the political capital to. So they just kind of nudge him time to time, sort of nudging him to do this or not do that. Let's see. So I don't think it's that relevant now, just for that reason. And how do I view Ayn Rand? I don't know a whole lot about her. I think I read, I think I read Atlas Shrugged. No, it wasn't. No, I read Anthem. I think that's the one I read.
Atlas Shrugged is the super long one.
Yeah, that's right. So I haven't read Atlas Shrugged. I think I did see the movie. There was an Atlas Shrugged movie, and it actually involved Ayn Rand. She was involved in the production, and there was like a big long speech at the end of the story. I hope I'm remembering this correctly. And it was at the end of the book too, and the film company wanted to cut it out. They wanted to cut it out or cut it down, and Ayn Rand wouldn't have it. She just put her foot down and demanded that this huge ass speech be included at the end of the movie. And so it's in there. They forced it. She forced it in. So it's a pretty honest. Well, again, as somebody who hasn't read a lot of Ayn Rand, I'm not in a position to determine how authentically Randist the movie is. But given that she was involved, I would imagine it's a safe bet it was a fairly faithful adaptation. So if you're really into Ayn Rand, maybe look into that movie. It's an older movie, like from way back in the 50s. I don't know how many people really know about it, but I remember it was on TV one day. So you might enjoy that if you are a Ayn Rand person. But I myself don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other. I just haven't really read that much about her. You know, she seems to be more of a embraced more by fringe political people, political ideologies, and as such, you know, her relevance is kind of limited. If she were to enter more of the mainstream, she would be more relevant, and then, you know, her ideas might have more of an impact. But, you know, until then, she's kind of more of a bit player. Her and her followers are sort of marginal players in the overarching political struggles going on right now.
One of my university roommates was really big into her for a little bit. He kind of backed off from it probably after about a year, but he read Atlas Shrugged and some other of her work. It's very hardcore individualist, almost to the point where it seems, well, not even almost, to the point where it's a little bit ridiculous, where there's not really regard for anything or anyone else, which one of the tenets of classical liberalism is you have to have some faith in institutions. And it's almost overly aggressive to the point where it doesn't sound very practical if it were to be implemented. It's a very dog-eat-dog that people are tools for me to use for my ends, and my perspective is the one that matters the most, which I think some people think that way, but she takes it to an extreme and then kind of builds an ideology around that.
I think she was from Russia originally. And she actually was, I think, nobility. And when she was a young child, she had to flee Russia because of the October Revolution. And I don't know if that influenced her, but it kind of sounds like it might have, you know, bitterness against communists. But I don't know enough about Ayn Rand to know just how much that really affected her, just how much of an ideologue she was, as opposed to just somebody who was traumatized as a child and was kind of spent her life responding to it. But I thought it was interesting that she did have that background, Russian nobility fleeing communism. It kind of makes sense, intuitively. Let's see, what do you think, if any, no, what action, if any, do you think Turkey is likely to take in Syria with regard to the YPG and SDF? Pretty much the only thing they can do is attack Afrin. That was kind of the extreme end of the possibilities, because Afrin was not protected by the American security umbrella. So that was an easy kill for them. But something like Manbij, you know, Manbij actually does have U.S. personnel on the ground. And the United States government has not signaled that it's willing to give that up. It's signaled that it's willing to negotiate. It's willing to kind of co-govern it, or at least to have the territory be co-governed by people who are not YPG, but who are maybe not SDF people, basically. People who are not Kurdish, but who are a part of the SDF coalition that encompasses YPG. And to have that co-governance be between SDF people and maybe some Turkish people. When I say Turkish people, I mean rebels aligned with Turkey, backed by Turkey. But I don't think they're going to leave. And I don't think SDF, they're going to just give the territory up to two Turkish-backed rebels for one reason or the other. And I don't think Turkey wants to really risk a conflict with the United States. I don't think they want to go and kill or possibly kill American personnel. they've been pretty thoroughly deterred thus far by the presence of personnel in Manbij. And so long as that's the case, so long as the U.S. signals that it's willing to defend the SDF and the YPG and et cetera in eastern Syria, I don't think they'll push into the territory. They might engage in some subterfuge, maybe some, what would you call it, subversion. They might pay some rebels in the territory to cause some trouble or something. But beyond that, I don't think there's a lot they can do in terms of like a direct attack, either with the Turkish armed forces or with Turkish-backed rebels, because either of those groups would be under attack from the United States, and I don't think they can win that kind of conflict. In that sense, I don't think they're going to do anything really. With regards to the YPG and SDF, yeah, there's just nothing they can do with the American umbrella there. At least tangible action. Again, maybe something intangible, maybe some indirect action.
One moment.
But I think
we just got like 500 people. So
oh wow.
To tie in, welcome. Thank you, Pig, for this massive host. I was about to wrap up, but it's one of those unspoken, unwritten rules of Twitch streaming where if someone gives you a massive host, you go longer. So, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Hope you had an awesome stream. I'm in Discord with a real-life friend. The Who Is It command explains who he is, where he's coming from. We're talking about the world. So, welcome. Maybe we'll tack on a half hour. Does that sound good to you?
Sure, that works with me. I'm sorry to keep you up late.
Sorry, no, this is good for business. We thank Pig. No apologies necessary. Welcome. What's up?
Thank you, Mr. Pig. Let's see. That's pretty much my perspective on the Turkish issue. I just don't think they're going to be able to do much there. So the next question was, here we go. What's your stance on gun ownership back-checking? Do you think the number of firearms in the U.S. is too high? Should the U.S. adopt and replace the Second Amendment with European gun laws? Very subjective question.
Well, we get this one almost every week. Gun ownership is something that especially Americans are very defensive about. I think because it's, for a lot of people, a hobby. Like collecting guns, it's material, it's interesting how they work. They talk about what they have. Sometimes they go outside and shoot them at targets and that kind of thing. So it's a national pastime in a way. So you could say we definitely have a gun violence problem in the country. We also have a lot of guns that are not used violently against other people, and it's, I think, that demographic of gun owners who are not shooting other people who get rustled when people are talking about having strict gun laws and stuff, and like, but I don't use my guns for that kind of stuff. Sort of a deal.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I would defer to that.
But my guns, Conan.
Yeah, my stance on gun ownership doesn't really matter. Whatever. I'm just for whatever the public can agree with. Whatever consensus can be reached one way or the other, I'm fine with. I'm not really that invested in the issue one way or the other. Do you think the number of firearms in the U.S. is too high? Again, doesn't matter to me. It's not like I live in a really violent area, and I don't get the impression that I'm at a significant risk of gun violence on account of the number of guns. So, again, it's a subjective question. Everybody kind of has to make that judgment for themselves. Should the U.S. adopt and replace the Second Amendment with European gun laws? Pretty sure that's not going to happen, regardless of whether or not the U.S. should or should not do it.
Some people would say yes to that.
Some people would say yes to that, that's true. And a lot of people would say a very, very virulent no.
Well, one thing that we haven't mentioned thus far is the presence of the NRA in politics. So we have the National Rifle Association, which is a conglomerate of something. There's a bunch of money and a bunch of interest in maintaining the amount of weapons and the proliferation of weapons for U.S. citizens. Like, they fund politicians, they kind of push things along, they very aggressively lobby in favor of making people have super easy access to purchasing firearms, because it's a business, right? Their business is selling guns, so they want to sell more guns to as many people who will buy them, and they want to make that process as easy as possible. And then on the flip side, we have a gun violence problem, so people are trying to make it more difficult to acquire guns, which is directly going against people who sell guns as their business.
Yeah, the NRA is a powerful lobbying organization. It's basically an NGO, a non-government organization, and it's nonprofit, engages in political activity of one sort or another, advocating, generally policy advocacy, pressuring politicians to pass this or that legislation, or not pass this or that legislation, generally more often. And they also generally get a lot of money from gun industry as well as from donations from supporters amongst the citizenry. And I think people get a little sidetracked by the NRA, because while the NRA is an influential political force, its political power does not come from its lobbying so much as its followers. There's a lot of people who support the NRA and the NRA agenda, even if they're not members of the NRA itself. And it's those people, that large number of people who are predisposed to support that agenda, that perspective. That's where the political power really comes from. It's the voters, not the money. And in that sense, I think people kind of focus too much on the NRA rather than on the people. If you got rid of the NRA tomorrow, I don't think it would really change anything, because you would still have that large body of pro-gun policy voters who would still want those policies and who would resist attempts to change those policies. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before about bottom-up versus top-down change. Getting rid of the NRA or passing gun laws is a top-down change that doesn't really address that large constituency of pro-gun people and pro-gun culture also in broad swaths of the country. Rural parts of the country in particular are defined by that. A top-down approach just kind of aggravates them, and they'll probably resist such laws in the same way that people resist marijuana laws and other unpopular legislation. A bottom-up approach would be better, in which you kind of proselytize amongst those people, if indeed you are pro-gun legislation, or rather anti-gun legislation. If you want more gun legislation, you would probably be better served proselytizing amongst the people who are pro-gun and trying to get them to either change their mind or at least reach a compromise, rather than just trying to disregard them and impose a policy change at the national level. That's my perspective anyway. Make of it what you will. Again, it's up to each individual to kind of determine for themselves what kind of gun policies they would want or not want. I'm not going to tell you what you to believe in that regard. Let's see, what caused corrupt... Oh, these are just questions from 2 weeks ago, aren't they?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't see the pattern. I thought people from 2 weeks ago were coming in and posting them again.
They're back.
They're back. What caused corruption in Mexican presidential elections, and how does this affect their international relationships? I don't think it really affects their international relationships, because generally it's a very domestic political thing. What kind of patronage can you give to what group? What kind of subsidies can you give to this industry? What kind of money can what money can you embezzle from what department? What have you? So it's not really something that factors into international relations per se. I guess you could argue that it makes the government, or that it makes the governance in Mexico worse, and that in so much as governance is worse, it influences the degree of cartel violence, and assists makes cartel violence worse in that way. There are some international implications there, in so much as cartel violence bleeds over the border into the United States and into Central America. But I don't think corruption per se is the issue there. I mean, poor governance goes beyond just corruption. It goes into political culture, it goes into institutional design. There's a lot of things that you would have to address there in order to kind of improve governance, such that something like cartel violence could be cracked down upon and mitigated. So I would argue that there's not a lot of international repercussions there. And again, I welcome criticism on that count. If there's somebody out there more familiar with the topic, I would welcome input. Again, if I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So, please do contribute in chat if that's the case. Let's see. But what caused corruption in Mexican presidential elections? It's a culture. It's a political cultural issue. Mexican political culture has been corrupt for a long time, and probably most of its history, really. It goes all the way back to the conquistadors, where you just have a elite strata of society, which is principally, white European descended from Spain, kind of controlling most of the economic resources in the country, and maybe not entirely dominating, but maybe lording over, let's put it like that, the rest of the population. And Mexico's political culture kind of evolved from that starting point. And because of that, there's sort of a system of norms in Mexico's political culture that sort of tacitly allows a little bit of corruption here and there, and which facilitates and kind of empowers people who want to engage in more production once they're in a position of more power. It doesn't help that patronage politics are a part of Mexican political culture, as I understand it, in which case corruption kind of gets institutionalized in the system. So those factors all lend themselves to corruption in politics generally, and then bleed over into things like presidential elections specifically. If there are any Mexicans listening, I would encourage them to contribute to chat in this regard if I'm making an ass out of myself. I hope I'm not. This is my understanding of Mexican political culture and political institutions. I haven't studied them in too much depth, though, so I would certainly welcome additional input and feedback on their part. I think we do have a few. I think they're generally the third largest contingent. Maybe not.
It depends on the time of day. If it's earlier in the day, then it's usually like US, Germany, Canada, UK. But in the evening when the Europeans are asleep, then yeah.
Yeah, that's what I see here on your chart. Ah, got a few Argentines. Hello, Argentines.
No, it's a fun little feature.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, as a geography guy, it's fun to just kind of look at it and think of the people listening. I'm tempted, I won't, but I'm tempted to just to get into country-specific issues, but I'll let it go. Let's see, what's your chance? Okay, what corruption? Any opinions on the Irish situation in regards to Brexit? How can they split from the EU while maintaining the Irish split? Yeah, this is the million-dollar question. So for those not familiar with this, pretty much everybody knows that the UK is leaving the European Union. That's the big Brexit referendum result. One of the thorny issues in that has been brought up by the UK leaving the European Union is what to do about Ireland. And the issue there is the Good Friday Agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement is an agreement that was signed, maybe signed isn't the right word, but that was agreed to by the two factions in the Northern Ireland, which had been a very violent place in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and perhaps also on into the 90s. And the violence finally ebbed with the Good Friday Agreement, in which the two major factions, the Protestants and Catholics, agreed to share power. Now, part of the one of the conditions of that agreement was an open border with Ireland, and that was easy to do because they basically already had one. There was to be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland itself. And that was a demand made by the Catholics, by the Catholic Irish. The big demand by the Irish has always been to have a unified island in which Northern Ireland is a part of Ireland again. Obviously, the Protestants in Northern Ireland, who are generally Scottish or Scots-Irish descended, they don't want that. They're unionists. They want to stay in the UK. But they agreed to give this concession to agree to always have an open border with Ireland. So long as the UK was in the European Union, that wasn't really a big ask. But now that the UK is leaving, there's this question of how do you maintain the Good Friday Agreement and maintain an open border with Ireland while at the same time leaving the European Union, which intuitively would require you to have a border so that you could prevent goods traded in the European Union from coming into the UK without paying tariffs. So if you're going to have a tariff regime, you need customs, some kinds of customs institution in which goods coming across the border are subject to customs duties. And the UK leaving the EU kind of makes that into a big problem. So Theresa May, the Prime Minister of Britain, has said that the UK is going to leave not only the single market, but also the customs union of the EU. And that really boxed her into a corner. Because if you leave the single market, that's fine, you could still have a more or less open border with Ireland if you still have the customs union. Because if you have the customs union, you're not really charging customs duties on goods coming across the border, so you don't really need that border there. But if you're going to leave the customs union too, then you kind of do need that. So Theresa May kind of backed herself into a corner where she needs both a customs union and to not be in the customs union at the same time. And there's been some ideas thrown around about a sort of electronic border in which goods and services are just kind of scanned, but which otherwise allows free movement of goods and services, if not also people. Free movement of people is another thing. If they leave the European Union, presumably there will be more restrictions on how easily people can move between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So the whole thing is a giant clusterfuck, basically. There's no easy solution to that, and I have no idea how the hell she's going to resolve that. It seems like she's inevitably going to have to disappoint somebody. She's either going to have to basically abridge the Good Friday Agreement and then reinstate the border there with Ireland, or renege on her promise to leave the customs union. I suspect, if I had to make a guess, I suspect that she'll end up reneging on the customs union promise. And she'll probably get into a bunch of trouble for that, and if she's still prime minister by that time, she's under a lot of pressure even now, but if she is still prime minister when she does that, that could well be the thing that topples her. Because there's a lot of people looking for excuses to get rid of Theresa May amongst the Tories, and I'm sure they would relish the opportunity to attack her if she does that. But I don't really know that there's really any other way to do it. I mean, maybe there's some really creative solution that but it would almost inevitably be really convoluted and complex to the point where it would almost defeat the purpose. You know, if it's sufficiently convoluted, then it's effectively a hard border. So I don't think there's any good solution to that, really. What are your thoughts on global centralized banking, and is it just coincidence that the U.S. biggest adversaries, Cuba, Iran, and North Korea, are the only countries without quote-unquote Rothschild central banks, or is this just a myth? Well, I'm inclined to think it's probably more of a myth, because there's a lot of other things North Korea, Cuba, and Iran have in common, beyond the fact that they're not incorporated into the international banking system, such as it is. Well, Cuba and North Korea, for one, are leftovers from the Cold War. That's the principal issue there. Most other countries that had been aligned with the Soviet Union after the Cold War ended ameliorated relations with the West. They were pretty willing to incorporate to some degree and to democratize to some degree. For most countries, that wasn't a big deal. They were still able, political parties, even communist parties, were still able to maintain power even while they did that. But North Korea and Cuba in particular were pretty recalcitrant. They have not been willing to do so. More so Cuba. They've been willing to engage a little more, relatively more reform than North Korea has. But the issue the United States has with North Korea and Cuba are more holdovers from the Cold War than anything. In Cuba's case, it's more political. There's a lot of interest groups in the United States that just don't like Cuba, especially the exile community in Florida. And Florida's a big swing state, so that means that successive administrations have felt a lot of pressure in order to not give too many concessions to Cuba, to not allow relations to kind of normalize too much. And then for North Korea, the issue has always been, for one, the nuclear program that's been over the past couple decades. And then before that, the DMZ, having basically, the Korean War never actually ended. This is still when I say we, I mean the United States, South Korea, and North Korea are technically in an armistice right now. So hostilities have not actually ended. This is just a sort of on-running ceasefire. Hypothetically, the Korean War could start up again at any time. And that being the case, it's no surprise that the United States does not have great relations with Pyongyang. If relations were to improve there would have to be some kind of nominal peace agreement that would actually be committed to by all parties involved over the long term. Until that happens, we're still more or less in a de facto state of war with North Korea. The United States is in a more or less de facto state of war with North Korea, and relations are poisoned by that. And then the other one, Iran, I mean, that's obvious. That's the Iranian Revolution, and the Iranians were not just anti-American; they were also anti-Soviet and anti-Western and just about anti-everything else. So it's no shock there that relations with Iran are poor. To say nothing of the fact that they've tried to expand influence in the region. They've supported Hezbollah, other groups that are inimical to the interest of the United States and its various allies in the region, in particular Saudi Arabia and Israel. So I don't think the United States goes after these three countries in particular because they're not integrated into the banking system. I don't think there's a banking cartel working behind the scenes to try to expand their power to every country on Earth and is pushing the United States government to try to force countries like these into the system as a kind of way to improve, I guess, profits. I don't know. It seems like if you're a global banking cartel that is effectively a shadow government operating behind the scenes, controlling everything, it seems like you wouldn't really be able to expand your power and influence much by getting Cuba, Iran, and North Korea. These are not exactly huge countries. So in general, I'm inclined to think it's more of a myth. I don't really think that perspective is based too much in reality. I recognize that there's some evidence. You know, people always have their evidence, but I don't think there's enough to warrant investing too much into this idea. Now, as to my thoughts on global centralized banking, that's a broad question, because that's a broad topic. You know, I mean, you could get into the politics and how they influence political decisions, policy making. You could get into the economic side. How does the global central banking system work? How does the financial sector in general work? You know, how do the institutions involved operate and interact with each other? What impact does it have on the broader economy? And there's also the social aspect. I mean, you could go on and on. So I mean, in general, the banking system serves a purpose, which is basically the capitalist equivalent of a central planning bureau and a command economy. They distribute resources, and it's more decentralized than a command economy, obviously, but effectively the role is similar. You know, their job is basically to figure out what areas they can commit resources to that will give them the biggest return, and then to commit those resources there. In a nutshell, that's what banking is all about. And it's profit-based, so they generally go with wherever the money is. And I might add here that money doesn't matter per se. That's very much an economist's perspective. What matters is not money. What matters is what the money is representing, the goods and services that are being traded. Money is just a tool to facilitate trade in those goods. And so those goods are really what counts. The banking sector and the financial sector generally plays an important role in facilitating that. You know, it makes more sense if you're a merchant, because if you have to trade a lot in a lot of goods and services and with a lot of different actors and people, currency helps a lot. It's a very useful tool for them. I recognize that it's a less useful tool if you're just sort of a worker. You know, in that case, something like gold would probably be better, something that stores value better over the long term, since you don't really have a lot of turnover that you need. Something that's very liquid for it. Currency is better for that. But I think global banking does serve a purpose. It is maligned a bit, I think sometimes unfairly. That's not to say there's not always something to malign. Certainly, banks have been responsible for sometimes egregious behavior of one sort or another. But in general, I think it is a useful institution. It does have a function that does need to be performed. Obviously, whether or not it could be better performed by a different institution or a different system is up to individual discretion. You know, people decide that for themselves. It's up to individual politics. I won't tell you what to believe on that count. But, you know, it is an important part of the status quo, anyway. It does perform an important institutional role. And in that sense, I think it is something more than just a profit-seeking enterprise for a select few, you know, puppet masters. You know, economic elite puppet masters of one sort or another. Let's see, do you think the recent events in the EU are indicative of long-term fracturing or isolated incidents? Well, that's a tough call. I mean, it's kind of too early to tell. I mean, it could fracture further depending on how the political and economic situation evolves going forward, but if I had to guess, I would say well, I wouldn't say it's isolated incidents either, because it is part of a general trend. I mean, we were talking earlier about the general populist tide in politics across the world, you know, not just in the West, but, you know, kind of almost everywhere. And yeah, I think that really what we're seeing is the European manifestation of that. I think there's a lot of churn in European politics, there's a lot of dissension, and there's a lot of infighting, but I don't think that's anything more than just the manifestation of that populist political wave. Now, whether that wave ends up fracturing the system in the long run, or if it ends up being co-opted and incorporated into the status quo in exchange for some concessions on certain issues, probably immigration, or if the populist wave ends up becoming the new status quo, either of the, you know, any of those could happen. It's quite possible, and it's hard to tell given how early it is in the process. Just what will happen. If I had to guess, I would suspect it will be some kind of synthesis. You know, immigration is really the most sensitive issue, so probably status quo players, you know, in the center will probably give concessions on immigration in terms of tighter immigration rules. In exchange, for populist acceptance of certain other aspects of the status quo, probably mostly economic. But I don't think you could call it isolated incidents. I think there's too much tying all the different incidents together to say that. But I don't think there's enough information yet to determine whether there will be long-term fracturing either. And there are a lot of forces in Europe that tie it together. You know, there's good economic reasons and political reasons to act as a group. And I think those forces will kind of act to keep the European Union together to some degree. It may not be to the same degree as now. And in fact, what you may see is a two-track Europe, in which there's a kind of periphery of European nations that want to be in the EU, that want to be in the European Union, but don't want the European to centralize too much, who don't want to give up too much sovereignty to the European Union bureaucracy. Those countries will kind of exist on the periphery of Europe in a sort of European Union light. And then there will be a core of European Union nations that exist in a tighter system that is more federalized. That could well happen, and I'm inclined to guess that that's probably what will happen in the future, given how much disagreement there is about, you know, what kind of European Union Europe needs in the future. So a different European Union for different countries, basically, depending on what they prefer. Let's see, it would be interesting to hear any thoughts on how Australia should manage both its private and public political stance with China, being so close, with the decline of the US as an ally. Yeah, that's a tricky one, because Australia is a lot smaller than China. China has a lot of leverage to bear since it's such a big trading partner with Australia. Yeah, it's a tough call. I mean, it kind of comes down to how much Australians are willing to sacrifice, because given that Australia, or rather given that China has so much leverage economically over Australia, if China really starts to intervene or intercede in Australian politics, I know there's a big conversation in Australia that's going on the past couple months about alleged Chinese intervention, influence on Australian politics. Allegations which are more substantive, I might add, than the allegations being made against Russia vis-a-vis the United States. But just how substantive they are and the degree to which Australia should act on them kind of depends on how much you're willing to risk retaliation. Because China has so much economic leverage, Australia, if it really wants to resist any kind of influence, it's going to have to plan around the expectation that that leverage will be used. So if Australia cannot survive or cannot tolerate a prolonged period in which economic links with China are disrupted by Chinese sanctions of one kind or another in response to Australian actions vis-a-vis alleged Chinese influence peddling in Australia of one sort or another, then you're probably just going to have to kowtow to China in that regard. Now, on the other hand, if there's enough political will to do that, then you could probably align more with the United States and have some kind of alternative arranged. But whatever the answer is, it's going to be immensely disruptive for Australia to really break with China openly, especially if it's over a really sensitive issue that triggers the Chinese government into laying out severe sanctions of one sort or another. I suspect the Australian government will end up trying to tread a middle path, kind of trying to have strong defense relations with the United States and trying to have as close a set of economic relations with the United States as they can achieve, while at the same time trying to maintain relations with China, just to keep them stable, basically. Maybe they don't want to get too close to China, maybe they don't go out of their way to improve links with China like they would with the US. But given how much China is growing, they don't have a lot of choice in that. Just organically, the economies are becoming more entwined. But hitting that middle path, trying to have stable relations with China without doing too much to upset them, but without getting too much closer, that's probably the path I would expect them to go with. It's kind of lazy. I mean, it's kind of a lazy path, because it's sort of intuitive in the default. You know, you're not really taking any risks there one way or the other. You know, if you get too close to China, there are political risks as far as Chinese influence, but then if you antagonize them too much, there are economic risks. So it might be more clear-cut as far as the long-term future for Australia if they just picked a side, if they picked a risk and went with it. But on the other hand, the benefit of treading the middle path is that you don't really make waves one way or the other. You're not really getting any of the benefits of one particular strategy, but you're not getting the excess risk or costs of those strategies either. So I think it would take like a major crisis of one sort or another to really push Australia one way or the other, to create the political will amongst the constituents in Australia to really support a big move towards China or towards the United States, or perhaps more accurately, against China. And given that the Chinese government isn't really that interested in putting a lot of pressure on other countries, unless it's over something it's really sensitive about. We've talked before about how the Communist Party of China doesn't really care that much about foreign policy. It's more just a tool by which they can exert more influence in China. It's a domestic political tool more than it is something that they pursue in and of itself. So in that sense, I don't think the party will give them much reason to really be too afraid. Obviously, there's some concerns about influencing Australian politics and etc. But I doubt that they'll go. I doubt that they would do much more than that. I doubt that they would do it so much that it would be really egregious, or that they would respond too dramatically if Australia took certain actions to try to mitigate that influence. And I don't think the United States would cause a crisis too big that would really push Australia to the Chinese either. I know some people are scared of the Trump administration and think he's on the verge of starting World War III, but that's probably not going to happen. And unless it happens, I think Australia will probably continue with that middle course. But beyond that, just what exactly you want to do just depends on your own preferences. I mean, well, you as in Australians. Just what kind of preferences they have in terms of managing risk, and what kind of relations they want to have with the US and China, and what kind of role they want to play in the Southeast Asian region, or within their region generally, whatever you want to call that, Oceania, I guess. If they want to have a stronger role as kind of more of an autonomous player, then they might try to mitigate ties with China and kind of go their own way. But on the other hand, if they're just more interested in treading water and kind of maintaining the status quo, the middle path would probably be preferred. And again, that's probably what I suspect most people in Australia would be for.
You heard him. Australia, you're in charge of your own fate and destiny. Be careful.
Yeah, I can't give you like really specific policies per se. I mean, you can do things like just ban Chinese from coming to Australia. That's one extreme end of it. Or you could have a very strict regulatory regime to ensure that Chinese money or Chinese agents are not influencing the political regime. But all of those carry certain risks as far as antagonizing China or what have you. And the broader question then is, how much risk are you willing to take on, and how much do you value taking action against China in that vein? And the answers to those questions will inform what kind of policies you want to take. I mean, once you have the answers to those questions and the political will, a united populace behind them, then it's kind of easy to pick solutions. Because then, normally the problem with picking policies in that way, picking policies in general, is figuring out what people are willing to agree to. But if everybody knows, especially in terms of risk management, but if everybody kind of knows how much risk they're willing to take or how much risk they want to aver, that makes it easier to kind of determine a policy. What are the long-term health effects of hiding amongst a group of ostriches and monkeys, and are you concerned for Neuro? I think he's all right. I think he can handle himself. I think you should be more worried for me if I were in that situation, because I doubt I could defend myself against ostriches. Neuro could probably beat them to death, if needed. He's a pretty fit guy.
Or just make friends with them. Use it as a mount.
There you go. Use them as a mount.
Yeah.
Dinosaur chocobos.
I know about video games. I've seen this done before. Watch me. It's going to increase my movement speed by 50%, guaranteed.
Well, that's all the questions we had. Was there anything else you wanted to go into, or did you want to call time?
Yeah, we'll probably call it. We got a good 8-hour, 46-minute stream today. Thanks, everyone, for checking out this latter half of the broadcast. I know some people who just watch StarCraft streams, and you wander into here and there's like a bunch of stuff being talked about. It's like, wait, what? We do this every Sunday. This is a segment we've been doing. I think this is episode 24 now.
That sounds about right.
The rest of them are on YouTube. I'll do his command again. We got some nice donations for him as well this week, so thank you very much, everyone there. Strophium.
Thank you again.
First time handling the questions. We appreciate Strophium very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Strophium.
Good job, dude. And yeah, we'll see you, fam, next time. Thank you very much, Agent Smith.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. Sweet, dude.